It is one of the world's most sacred documents. It is a product of the eternal search for liberty and freedom. It reflects the times during which it was conceived, and at the same time, it has been a guide to an unknown and rapidly changing future. It is the United States of America's Constitution. In this series, we shall see how this document has served to shelter the American people from the abuses of power and tyranny. How for over 2 centuries the U.S. Constitution has empowered Americans to excel and aspire to greatness. Great art, great literature, excellence and leadership in science and technology. And how the Constitution has allowed the United States to become the most prosperous and most powerful nation the planet has ever seen.
Hello, I'm Jeff Fahey, and welcome to the first episode of A History of the United States Constitution. The seeds for the United States Constitution were sown remarkably by the first colonists who arrived on the Atlantic coast. They arrived as Englishmen and women, but quickly, if they were to survive, they had to transform themselves into rugged, independent Americans. Although not yet American in name, these early colonists wanted freedom. Freedom that would define the American way of life. In particular, they wanted religious freedom, the right to own their own land, and they wanted to live under the rule of law. And most of all, they wanted to create a new, secure home. For the first 100 years, the English colonists in America were left alone by their mother country. We will see in this program how during this time of benign neglect, they built institutions of self-government, which later would become the inspiration for the United States Constitution. And we will see how the increased abuse of governmental power by the English throne laid the foundation for the Bill of Rights. Equally remarkable in the first 100 years, the ancestors of the Constitution's framers engaged in powerful experiences of democratic self-rule. Building on the great political and philosophical thinkers of the time, such as John Locke, David Hume, and Sir William Blackstone, they experimented with representative government and even versions of governing constitutions. At the same time, the Puritans brought with them the ideals of liberty, human rights, and intellectual pursuits, which they firmly planted in the emerging American psyche.
In 1607, men, Englishmen, boarded ships like these. They were bound for the New World, the mid-Atlantic coast. 100 years later, at the beginning of the 18th century, their numbers would grow to over 250,000 spread out over 12 colonies. During that span of time, these forerunners of the United States would learn how to survive in a hostile and foreign environment, create many experiments in representative government, build a legal system, and fight wars. They would also show great religious tolerance and great religious intolerance, show intense loyalty to the English monarchy, and engage in treasonous behavior. In these first 100 years, the foundation for the grand adventure in self-government would be laid by those who rode the seas to places like Plymouth Plantation and Jamestown. The first permanent English settlement in America was Jamestown. It was a business venture of the Virginia Company. But unlike the Spanish and Portuguese explorers to the south and the French to the north, the Virginia colonists found no wealth in gold or furs. But this lack of easy wealth was a blessing, forcing the colonists by their own enterprise to create that wealth through independent commerce and industry. Who were these early business adventurers? They were drawn from every class, noblemen and younger aristocratic sons who had few chances for land and power in England, investors and merchants, middle-class sons who wanted a new start, and then there were the poor who came as indentured servants. Life for these settlers was a struggle. Many died from disease and starvation. In fact, Jamestown was on the brink of failure when in 1614 John Rolfe sent the first shipment of tobacco to England, marking the beginning of a lucrative industry. In that same year, private ownership of land was instituted for the settlers. Private land ownership would become the cornerstone of American democracy. Indeed, for many years, land ownership determined who had the right to govern. In 1619, now on their way to establishing a flourishing tobacco industry, Virginia planters held the first legislative assembly in the New World. Called the House of Burgesses, its members passed their first laws that same year. It marked the beginning of democratic representative government. In the years that followed, Virginia would become a leader for independence and democracy in the colonies. It was from the House of Burgesses that Patrick Henry delivered his famous speech that included his immortal phrase for freedom, "Give me liberty or give me death." The greatest difference between the immigrants from England and those from other European countries was in the religious diversity of its settlers. This religious diversity included Quakers, Catholics, and many denominations of Protestants. But the most significant of these were the Puritans. In 1620, they arrived on the Mayflower at Plymouth Plantation, which later became known as Massachusetts Bay Colony. The beliefs and practices of the Puritans profoundly shaped what would become the American character and were the wellspring of American ideals: liberty, human rights, self-government, education, and intellectual thought. As nonconformists, the Massachusetts Puritans were constantly at odds with the monarchy. In the 17th century, Massachusetts Bay routinely ignored dictums from London. Indeed, Massachusetts became the early hotbed of revolution as America moved further towards self-government. However, Puritanism had its extremist, dark side. Puritans were religious bigots who murdered Quakers and burned witches at Salem, Massachusetts in 1692. But in a curious way, the Puritans' religious persecution fostered religious tolerance in other colonies such as Rhode Island, Maryland, and Pennsylvania. In fact, this religious turmoil and diversity of early colonial America produced the two most important pieces of American democracy: the separation of church and state, and freedom of speech and expression of ideas. Ignored by London, the colonists quickly developed ideas of self-government. It was in Maryland, one of the religiously tolerant colonies, that a prototype of the U.S. Constitution emerged in 1635. Under the terms of its charter, its proprietor, Lord Baltimore, was required to gain the assent of the colony's freemen to any legislation. In the 17th century, a freeman was any male who could vote for representatives to a legislative assembly. At the same time, there emerged throughout the colonies the phenomenon of town meetings that dealt with local interests and needs. Citizens gathered to decide on matters of taxes, education, public law, and charity, and eventually, revolution. In 1638, colonial leader Thomas Hooker opened a town meeting in Connecticut with these prophetic words: "The foundation of authority is laid in the free consent of the people." His belief that all men should have a voice and a vote were in treasonous opposition to monarchy rule. In 1669, the proprietors of the Carolina colonies issued the Fundamental Constitution. Written by John Locke, it laid out a blueprint for government. 118 years later, the United States of America adopted a permanent blueprint for government with the writing of the Constitution. Carolina's Fundamental Constitution was followed in 1680 with William Penn's famous Form of Government, another blueprint, this time stressing limitations on the process of governing. By the beginning of the 18th century, All the English colonies had some form of representative government, a newfound religious tolerance, and institutions of education which produced an intelligentsia that understood the basis of English law, liberty, and property, first expressed in the Magna Carta in 1215 and later clarified in the English Bill of Rights in 1689. What was equally remarkable in these first 100 years is what did not happen. Left largely to themselves by England, the colonies did not become a theocracy, nor were they ruled by dictators or despots, nor did they become colonial fiefdoms granted by English kings. As the 18th century dawned, the benign neglect of the American colonies would come to an end. The English Parliament was determined to take a more active role in governing. But it was too late. Something new for mankind had started, and it could not be stopped. It was a new kind of self-rule by the people, of the people, and for the people.
In the first third of the 18th century, the now 13 English colonies flourished. Many of their inhabitants had never set foot on English soil. As a result, a unique American character was developing. However, for the first time, the colonies were dragged into the constant wars between England, France, and Spain. For the British monarchy, the American colonies were becoming pawns to advance its own political and economic interests. In retrospect, the Molasses Act of 1733 was the first in a series of restrictive economic controls placed on the colonists that would lead to the Revolutionary War. Indeed, freedom of economic opportunity would become central in the writing of the Constitution.
In Great Britain during the 17th and 18th century, two products from the New World were king: tobacco, which came from Britain's Atlantic seaboard colonies, and sugar, which came from her colonies in the West Indies. In fact, from the beginning, Britain's settlement of the New World fell into two distinct colonial assets. One was her American colonies, which would eventually become the United States. The other was a chain of small tropical islands in the Caribbean. This ring of volcanic peaks was highly fertile and ideal for growing sugarcane. Some of the islands were controlled by France, Spain, and the Netherlands. The English islands were Barbados and Jamaica. In 1650, more white settlers lived on these two islands than all the eastern seaboard colonies combined. The main crop of the islands was sugar, and producing it was a complex, labor-intensive affair. Cut sugarcane spoiled quickly, if not processed immediately. It had to be harvested, milled, and boiled in a very short period of time, all in the steaming heat of the tropics. The end products were brown sugar and molasses, which could then be turned into rum. The sugar planters needed a large compliant labor force to perform the harvesting and manufacturing of sugar products. They quickly learned that whites would not do this work. The solution was the vast importation of slaves from Africa. The culture that quickly arose on the islands was a minority white elite who owned the plantations, ancillary businesses and crafts, and a black slave majority who performed all the menial labor. By the 18th century, the seeds of this societal structure had been transplanted to the American South, where they flourished. In 1733, the ruling elite on the West Indies Islands asked the British Parliament to pass legislation restricting the American colonies to trade for sugar and molasses only with their islands. Passage of the Molasses Act, as it was called, upset the American colonies. Although the act went largely unenforced, it demonstrated to the American colonists that Britain was not concerned with their economic interests. A secondary consequence was that the colonies continued to trade with the French West Indies through smuggling. This produced a separate non-British industry, one that heightened the sense of the colonies' need for independence.
2 years after the Molasses Act, freedom of the press was elevated to the most sacred of American rights in the famous trial of printer Peter Zenger.
America is a nation of laws. Laws and their interpretations that are finally arbitrated by a jury of ordinary citizens. As a result, the nation's sentiment and mind has always been partially defined by a series of famous jury trials. The first in this long tradition of spectacular trials is the case of German printer Peter Zenger. Like the other American colonies in 1731, New York was ruled by a governor appointed by officials in Britain. In that year, the newly arriving governor was William Cosby. Described as a spiteful, creepy, and quick-tempered man, he quickly alienated influential citizens when he fired Chief Justice Lewis Morris over salary claims. As a result, a new political faction was formed, the Popular Party, which challenged Cosby's ability to govern. The party appealed to Peter Zenger, one of 2 printers in the colony, to publish a newspaper called the New York Weekly Journal. In the paper's second issue, an editorial appeared about Governor Cosby.
The loss of liberty in general would soon follow the suppression of the liberty of the press, for it is an essential branch of liberty, so perhaps it is the best preservation of the whole.
Cosby immediately ordered Zenger's newspapers be burned in public and that the printer be arrested for libel. Months later, his trial began on July 29, 1735. 12 jurors were seated in spite of Cosby's attempts to rig the jury process. In defense of Peter Zenger was Andrew Hamilton, perhaps the most prestigious Philadelphia lawyer of the time. Hamilton argued that the libel law of England ought not to be the libel law of New York, and took the position that truth should be the defense of the charge of libel.
The course of English liberty is at stake, the liberty of exposing and opposing arbitrary power by speaking and writing the truth. Andrew Hamilton.
In Hamilton's closing statement, he made a glorious plea for liberty in the free press.
The loss of liberty to a generous mind is worse than death. A man who loves his country prefers its liberty to all other considerations, well knowing that life without liberty is a misery. The question before you in the court, gentlemen of the jury, is not of small private concern. It's not the cause of one poor printer, nor of New York alone. No! It may, in its consequences, affect every free man that lives under a British government on the main of America.
The jury deliberated a short time and returned with the verdict of not guilty. Zenger's acquittal is considered the foundation of American freedom of the press. One of the drafters of the Bill of Rights, Lewis Morrison's great-grandson, wrote of this decision,
"The trial of Zenger in 1735 was the germ of American freedom, the morning star of that liberty which subsequently revolutionized American freedom."
However, at the time of the Zenger trial, printing and the press did not come easily in the colonies. While printing flourished in Europe, it was hard to find printing presses in the colonies. England and the colonies' governors considered free information among its subjects dangerous. Gradually, by the time of the Revolution, there were 37 independent newspapers in the colonies. Today, America, with all its newspapers, magazines, and television, values freedom of speech over any other nation.
In 1739, 2 events occurred. One was the seed of the Constitution's great triumph, a triumph unequaled in the world: freedom of religion and the separation of church and state. The other was the seed of the Constitution's great failure, and a failure that would lead to its near-fatal self-destruction: the failure to end the enslavement of black Americans. Grappling with the contradiction of slavery was something even the Founding Fathers were unwilling to deal with. However, the Great Awakening not only produced a profound zeal for the separation of church and state, it also started the abolitionist movement and the slow march toward constitutional protection of all Americans.
Along this river in Charleston, South Carolina, would occur an event that would seal the fate of race relations in the United States for the next 270 years. During the 18th century, black slavery was endemic in the British colonies, as well as the Spanish and French colonies. Slavery started early in 1619 with the arrival at Jamestown, Virginia, of a ship carrying 20 black slaves. For the next 189 years, ships arriving from West Africa carried black slaves as cargo to the New World in the largest forced migration the world has ever seen. The black Africans were transported in the most dreadful of conditions. Still, during the 17th century, the black population remained small. Only in the 18th century, when the European style of farming was replaced by the large plantations started in the Chesapeake Bay area of Maryland and the tidewater areas of Virginia and Carolina, did their numbers grow. By the year 1739, South Carolina had over 32,000 slaves, and blacks were the majority population. A Swiss visitor at the time wrote, "This colony looks more like a Negro country than a country settled by white people." In South Carolina, black opposition to slavery was a way of life, and the potential for open violence terrified many whites. Consequently, colonial officials urged armed militias to patrol for suspicious blacks. By the summer of 1739, South Carolina's black majority seethed with resistance to slavery. Many of the slaves in the area came from present-day Angola, Africa, spoke the same language, and had kinship ties. But most of all, they were united by the drumbeat of freedom and the cry of liberty. Very quickly, in many counties, open rebellion erupted. In Charleston, a group of slaves set out for St. Augustine, Florida, and freedom. Before they were stopped, 21 whites and 44 blacks were killed. In the township of Berkeley, slaves struck again for freedom. But the most imposing revolt happened at Stono River. There, a slave named Cato led a group of 20 slaves against their white masters. They killed 2 warehouse guards and stole guns and gunpowder and fled south, killing whites and gathering more slaves as they went until their numbers swelled to 80. South Carolina officials called out the militia, which subdued the revolt. 25 whites and 50 blacks were killed in the battle. But the effects of the Stono slave rebellion reached far into the future and cemented for all time Southern fears of blacks. It drew the color line with a bold marker and forbade anyone to help blacks. By 1740, the slavery system in colonial America was fully developed. He has been described as short, slight of build, and cross-eyed. He was young, only 25 years old when he arrived in Philadelphia from England in 1739, on his way to set up an orphanage in Savannah, Georgia. But he was a preacher, the likes of which had never been seen before in the colonies. He was George Whitefield, and his sermons would forever change the social and religious landscape of America. The event that Whitefield initiated was called the Great Awakening and was second only to Martin Luther's Reformation in transforming Christianity. Before Whitefield's arrival, the colonies were predominantly Protestant, divided into sects that were largely hostile to each other. However, Americans at that time were the least church-going people in the Western world. In New England in 1721, 75% of the people shunned the church. Yet thousands came to hear Whitefield, who was a fire and brimstone preacher. Whether he preached from a pulpit or in the field, Whitefield's sermons, delivered in his unique theatrical style, appealed to the emotions and the heart while disdaining any church doctrine. In one of his most notable addresses, Whitefield thundered,
"Father Abraham, who have you in heaven? Any Episcopalians? No. Any Presbyterians? No. Any Independents or Methodists? No, no, no. Whom have you there? We don't know those names here. All who are here are Christians.
Whitfield's revival-style meetings spread throughout the colonies until 1744, when the Great Awakening sputtered to a humble end. But the changes the Awakening brought about continued. The monolithic sect splintered into numerous denominations that were suited to individual preferences. Through this proliferation, they became less hostile to each other, which helped to break down barriers between colonies. The experience of the Great Awakening also cut across class lines, so that people no longer defined themselves in terms of class distinctions. Revival meetings were attended by young and old, rich and poor, educated and illiterate, men and women, and were even open to blacks and Native Americans. The result was social status became more fluid, supporting the purely American philosophy, anyone can make it. The newly enlightened of the Great Awakening turned their attention to education, founding many of today's Ivy League schools, including Princeton and Dartmouth. Science and natural history became acceptable areas of study. All sides of American society, religious and secular, moved toward the separation of church and state. Keep government out of religion, and religion out of government. The Great Awakening also promoted individualism, and voluntary organizations became the favorite way for carrying out programs that have previously been done by the church. This form of political and membership organization flourished in the 19th century and remains a prominent feature of the American landscape. Today, fire and brimstone preachers can still be found on TV or sermonizing under a tent, but never again has American society been dominated by this evangelical style of Christianity, as were the colonies from 1739 to 1744. George Whitfield himself died in Philadelphia in 1770.
In the next episode of A History of the United States Constitution, Britain continues its governmental abuse of power over the colonies until the fight for freedom becomes inevitable. I'm Jeff Fahey, and thanks for watching.
It is one of the world's most sacred documents. It is a product of the eternal search for liberty and freedom. It reflects the times during which it was conceived, and at the same time, it has been a guide to an unknown and rapidly changing future. It is the United States of America's Constitution. In this series, we shall see how this document has served to shelter the American people from the abuses of power and tyranny. How for over 2 centuries the U.S. Constitution has empowered Americans to excel and aspire to greatness. Great art, great literature, excellence and leadership in science and technology. And how the Constitution has allowed the United States to become the most prosperous and most powerful nation the planet has ever seen.
Hi, I'm Jeff Fahey. In the second episode of A History of the United States Constitution, the American character continues to become increasingly distinct from Britain. In the 25 years from 1750 to 1774, a group of brilliant American thinkers led by Ben Franklin, James Otis, and Samuel Adams see the possibility of a new nation, the possibility of a nation built upon a unique concept of self-government and upon human rights for all. The issue facing the colonists during this period were, could the 13 colonies become one nation? And could that nation preserve and pass on the rights and freedom gained in battle to all future generations of Americans? The answers would be found in the writing of the United States Constitution. Andrew Jackson, the seventh American president, equated the freedom set forth in the Constitution as the freedom to pursue unfettered economic opportunity. This idea arose in response to the Iron Act of 1750.
The mighty American iron and steel industry that cast the machines which carried the United States through the Industrial Revolution and forged the nation into the preeminent world power of today can trace its origins back to small backyard forges in the 18th century. By 1750, every colony north of Virginia was dotted with small ironworks. At the center of the colonial iron industry was Pennsylvania, with over 70 iron plantations, company towns dedicated to the manufacture of iron products. Skilled craftsmen turned iron into hardware items equal to any in the world: scythes, pots, knives, axes, kettles, and perhaps most importantly, rifles. Long rifles that would be put into the hands of every frontiersman to defend his land from Indian attack, and every Minuteman to wage war on the British. From the inception of the colonies, the need to provide their own industry was a characteristic of the American experience. Leaders realized the colonies needed to be independent of the mother country, and one way to do this was the manufacture of ironware. Early on, the Massachusetts colony paid a bounty for the discovery of iron ore. However, it was the building of a forge in 1716 in the iron-rich Schuylkill Valley of Pennsylvania that would mark the true beginnings of the American iron industry. Here existed abundant iron ore, water, and timber to fuel the furnaces of iron manufacture. From the British perspective, the manufacturing of iron into useful products was not the way colonial trade should work. The colonies were supposed to send raw materials to the mother country in exchange for manufactured goods. Only now, they were creating finished iron goods, not only for themselves, but also for world export. The result was the idling of thousands of British iron workers. Consequently, in 1750, Britain's Parliament passed the Iron Act, which essentially forbid the building of new iron forges in the colonies, while at the same time encouraging the export of pig iron to Britain. The act was doomed to failure, especially since the British would soon rely heavily upon American manufacture during the French and Indian War. But the act pointed out the growing separation of interest between the colonies and Britain. In the last part of the 18th century, the Delaware Valley in Pennsylvania became the richest manufacturing center in North America. Although nearly all the colonies had manufactures of some kind, Pennsylvania's Delaware Valley, because of the abundance of iron and coal, outstripped the others with their production. The label land of opportunity might seem a trite phrase to those of us looking back 300 years, but the greatest industrial nation on the planet rose above the manufactures of Britain and Europe exactly because opportunity did exist in this wild, untamed land of the 18th century. In the next century, that opportunity would be exploited by men like Andrew Carnegie, who organized steel production into a monopoly that became the foundation of American industry well into the 20th century, driving the economy in everything from transportation to manufacturing. In the 21st century, it is humbling and informative to note that America's vast fortune and industrial might descended from small backyard forges and furnaces 300 years ago.
An early draft of the United States Constitution and its unique concept of representative government was laid out by the senior founding father Ben Franklin in his 1754 Albany Plan of Union.
It is proposed humble application be made for an Act of Parliament of Great Britain, by virtue of which one general government may be formed in America, including all the said colonies, within and under which government each colony may retain its present constitution, that the said general government be administered by a President General, to be appointed and supported by the Crown, and a Grand Council to be chosen by the representatives of the people. Benjamin Franklin.
These opening lines of a plan for an intercolonial union were presented to representatives at a meeting in Albany, New York, in the year 1754. Many of these delegates had been born in the United States and had never been to Europe. Perhaps the most fitting question to ask of this moment in history was, were these men British subjects, or were they becoming something else? At Albany, Benjamin Franklin argued that they were becoming something else, and to underscore his point, ran in his Pennsylvania Gazette newspaper a woodcut of a disjointed snake with the nation's first slogan, "Join or die." However, Franklin soon realized that in 1754 the time was not yet right for union.
Everyone cries a union is necessary, but when they come to the manner and form of the union, their weak noodles are perfectly distracted. Benjamin Franklin.
Franklin's Albany Plan of Union was doomed to failure from the start. The colonies were still not sufficiently enjoined to form a union against a common enemy. The necessity of union would be shown them in the French and Indian War, and the actions by the Crown in the decade following the war's end. But the plan was important in that it laid out the blueprint for the representative kind of government that would later bear fruit in the Constitution of the United States.
Six years after Franklin's Albany Plan, another founding father laid the framework for the eventual writing of the Bill of Rights. He was James Otis.
He is the least known of the United States founding fathers. He reportedly coined the phrase, "Taxation without representation is tyranny." And with John Adams looking on, he was the first American lawyer to argue in court for the doctrine of natural law, the underlying rights of all citizens which would form the base of the Bill of Rights. By 1760, Britain was winning the French and Indian War. However, there was alarm over the amount of colonial shipping that was still going to France. Armed with writs of assistance, customs officials searched for illegal cargoes and soon were pulling in shipments worth thousands of pounds. Writs were general warrants that allowed naval officers and customs officials to search private property without offering evidence of suspected smuggled goods. Boston merchants needed someone to take up their cause. James Otis took the case without pay. In February 1760, Otis argued the case, a case that he lost. But his 4-hour argument brought into focus the fundamental principle of security, which was close to the heart of every American colonist. Otis's presentation had such a strong effect on John Adams and others, as it laid the foundation for the Fourth Amendment, the right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures. 50 years later, John Adams said of Otis's argument, "Then and there, the child independence was born."
In the next two segments, we will see how taxation without representation and the invasion of privacy in one's home brought the colonists to war with Britain.
It seemed harmless enough. A little stamp on legal documents. Certainly not something that would launch a revolution. But the Stamp Act of 1765, part of a series of taxes imposed by Britain on her American colonies, did just that. It started the American Revolution. 2 years before, Britain had won the French and Indian War, gaining Canada and the Mississippi River Basin from France. But the cost of the war had been high. Now the country was experiencing an economic depression, and the government was in debt. Britain's new Lord of the Treasury, George Grenville, drew up a plan to reduce that debt through a series of taxes on the colonies. At the time, Americans were the least taxed people in the Western world, and the British Parliament thought that the colonies would go along with new taxes to help the mother country. However, the British government made two fundamental mistakes. It did not understand the sentiment on taxation in the colonies, and it misjudged its own supremacy over America. The reaction to the Stamp Act was explosive. Since the Stamp Act required a fee or tax for all documents and newspapers, it affected every aspect of colonial life from commerce to marriage. To get the stamp, one needed to pay the government. Virginia reacted first. A young Patrick Henry, one of the great heroes of the American Revolution, rose in the Virginia House of Burgesses to read 7 resolutions against the Stamp Act. Old Guard members of the House reacted with cries of treason, to which Patrick Henry answered, "If this be treason, then make the most of it." Henry's resolutions against the Stamp Act were printed and widely circulated throughout the colonies. The reaction was at once momentous and even violent. In the fall of 1765, what became known as the Stamp Act Congress convened in New York. It consisted of representatives from 9 of the colonies. It was the first time the colonies had come together on their own. After 2.5 weeks, they accepted the right of the British Parliament to make laws for them, but rejected its right to tax them. Other reactions to the Stamp Act were more violent. Mobs calling themselves the Sons of Liberty attacked tax distributors, ransacking their homes and businesses. Britain's reaction to colonial protests were ambiguous. At that moment, Britain could have taken control of the colonies, but it did not. Instead, in the name of expediency, Parliament repealed the Stamp Act without it really ever taking effect. In that moment, the colonies were lost. The American Revolution had begun, and most of the British did not even know it, and a little stamp took its monumental place in history. Today, in the 21st century, more Americans buy land and build their own homes than in any time in our nation's history. In fact, ownership of homes is the greatest it has ever been in our country. Americans feel safe in their homes, safe in the knowledge that the Constitution of the United States protects them from unwarranted government invasion of their property. Indeed, nowhere in the world is the saying, "A man's home is his castle," more apt than in the United States. This sanctity of American homes can be traced back to the 18th century, to a time 10 years before the Revolutionary War, when British troops occupied the colonies. During this period, British soldiers could enter American homes without warrants and conduct illegal searches. Even worse, colonists were forced against their will to house these same soldiers in their homes. The anger over this practice was a major cause of the Revolutionary War. After the French and Indian War ended in 1763, British troops remained in the colonies, supposedly to defend against Indian raids. But tension between the mother country and the colonies grew when Britain taxed the colonies for the war. But the colonists refused to pay and denounced the taxes as illegal. Soon British troops were no longer guarding against Indians, but were there to keep the colonists in line. In 1773, the most spectacular protest was the famous Boston Tea Party, where colonists, dressed as Native Americans, threw thousands of pounds of British tea into Boston Harbor. In retaliation, Britain's Parliament enacted a series of provocative laws dubbed the Intolerable Acts by the colonists. This legislation punished Boston and re-established British authority over Massachusetts. But the most inflammatory measure affected all the colonies. The Quartering Act of 1774 required that colonists house British troops in their homes. As a result, the Quartering Act of 1774 led directly to the Third Amendment of the United States Constitution.
Third Amendment. No soldier shall in time of peace be quartered in any house without the consent of the owner, nor in time of war, but in the manner to be prescribed by law.
Today, in the 21st century, vast changes in the technology of war have made the Third Amendment largely unnecessary. But the right of citizens to be safe in their homes remains a cornerstone of American freedom.
The Third Amendment to the Constitution directly addressed Britain's Quartering Act of 1774. It's an amendment which today seems almost an afterthought. Not so with the Second Amendment.
The notion of a militia, of a citizen army, goes back more than 1,000 years to England's 9th century king, Alfred the Great. 800 years later, 17th century American colonists were forced to reinvent the militia, not only to protect their settlements and farms from Indian raids, but to war against Native American tribes when necessary. Indeed, Massachusetts Bay Colony established the first organized militia in 1636. Eventually, all the colonies followed suit. During the 18th century, militia were raised to fight the Spanish and French in Queen Anne's War and King George's War. Then from 1756 to 1763, American militiamen fought alongside English soldiers in the French and Indian War. But the American militia reached its pinnacle during the Revolutionary War. After the French and Indian War, tensions between Britain and her North American colonies escalated rapidly. Samuel Adams's Sons of Liberty, originally founded to protest the Stamp Act of 1765, changed tactics and incited mobs to attack customs inspectors and tax collectors. In New York and Boston, they erected liberty poles as symbols of their protests. In almost game-like fashion, British troops tore them down. Then on March 5th, 1770, these brawls turned deadly. An angry mob looking for trouble descended upon troops guarding the customs house in Boston. The citizens threw oyster shells and sticks at the nervous troops, daring them to fire. The scared soldiers disobeyed orders and fired unexpectedly into the crowd. By the time a British officer stopped the shooting, 5 Americans were dead. Paul Revere immortalized the event in his famous woodcut, The Boston Massacre. By now, America and Britain were headed irrevocably toward war. It was only a question of when. It was fitting that Massachusetts, home of the first colonial militia, would be where the Revolutionary War began. Here, in September 1774, the townspeople of Concord formed the first Minuteman Company. The Minutemen were charged to stand at a minute's warning in case of alarm. Other towns followed suit, and very soon there were several companies of men who vowed to be ready to fight at a minute's notice. Though these companies had their own officers and men, they were still part of the Massachusetts militia. Then on April 19, 1775, these brave farmers and townsmen got the call. British troops were marching towards Concord to disarm the Sons of Liberty and take away their rifles. On that spring morning, 70 American Minutemen answered the call and gathered at Lexington to meet British troops marching from Boston. Greatly outnumbered, the Americans were quickly routed. 10 colonists were killed and 9 wounded. So began the first battle of the American Revolutionary War, a battle that continued at Concord, where nearly 1,000 militiamen met British soldiers. Fighting Indian style, the Americans pursued the British back to Boston. By the time the fighting ended, 273 British troops and 95 Americans had died, and the war had begun in earnest. For the next 6 years, the state's militia and the American Army battled British troops to final victory at Yorktown. The war was over. But the framers of the Constitution understood that the necessity for an army and militia was not. As a result, the Second Amendment of the Constitution addressed this critical need that had been a part of settlement in North America since the founding of the first colonies.
Second Amendment. A well-regulated militia, being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed.
Almost immediately, the new Congress, set up by the Constitution of the United States, took up the matter of the militia in the Militia Act of 1792. This was a direct result of the former Congress's slow reaction to Shays' Rebellion in 1786. The Act of 1792 defined the role of the militia in federal policy. The president could call out the militia in times of national emergency. All able-bodied men aged 18 to 45 were required to serve in the militia. They had to provide their own arms and participate in annual musters. The act also called for these militias to be organized in standard divisions, brigades, regiments, battalions, and companies. This act and the Second Amendment were largely the result of the founders' fear of a large standing army that could become a tool for a tyrannical abuse of power. Throughout the 19th century, this approach served the nation well. The regular army remained, but the militia provided most of the troops in the War of 1812, the Mexican-American War, during the early stages of the Civil War and the Spanish-American War. Then in 1903, the Dick Act replaced the 1792 Militia Act and created the National Guard as the Army's primary organized reserve. In the second half of the 20th century, a vigorous debate began over the framers' intent for the Second Amendment. Some Americans thought the Second Amendment irrelevant in a country where there was no longer a hostile frontier. That vast numbers of handguns, rifles, and even assault rifles that existed in America's cities, towns, and farms were a threat to the safety and welfare of its citizens. Others, such as the National Rifle Association, believed that this right was one of the most fundamental to the preservation of freedom and democracy. The NRA has spent millions annually lobbying members of Congress to protect the right of all Americans to keep and bear arms. And in some states, citizens created their own private militias, training as weekend soldiers to protect their homes and families, not necessarily from an external enemy, but the government itself. The U.S. Supreme Court could easily end the debate, but has made only one decision. Yet the court's ruling in the 1939 case, U.S. v. Miller, which dealt with the interstate transport of a double-barreled sawed-off shotgun, was ambiguous. Justice McReynolds, writing for the court, seemed to be saying that the right of the individual to bear arms was limited to the arms a militia might have. Yet at the same time, he seemed to be saying that the amendment did not guarantee the right to possess firearms to individuals. Since then, the Supreme Court has ducked the issue of the rights of a gun-toting citizenry. However, in Dallas, Texas, in the 2001 case of U.S. versus Emerson, The Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals delivered an opinion that the Second Amendment does guarantee individuals, not just members of the militias, the right to possess arms. In the 21st century, this debate continues.
With war now inevitable, the Founding Fathers had to create a government for the newly independent nation. In the next episode of A History of the United States Constitution, the Constitution and the Bill of Rights are written. I'm Jeff Fahey, and thanks for watching.
It is one of the world's most sacred documents. It is a product of the eternal search for liberty and freedom. It reflects the times during which it was conceived, and at the same time, it has been a guide to an unknown and rapidly changing future. It is the United States of America's Constitution. In this series, we shall see how this document has served to shelter the American people from the abuses of power and tyranny. How for over 2 centuries the U.S. Constitution has empowered Americans to excel and aspire to greatness. Great art, great literature, excellence and leadership in science and technology. And how the Constitution has allowed the United States to become the most prosperous and most powerful nation the planet has ever seen.
It was the most remarkable of times. In the midst of a war for independence against a well-trained military machine, the Founding Fathers of the United States created a brand new government. And when it didn't work, they created an even better one. Not just any government, but one the likes of which the world had never seen. I'm Jeff Fahey, and thanks for joining me in the 3rd episode of A History of the United States Constitution. The 16 years from the first shot at Lexington until the ratification of the Bill of Rights were filled with high drama. How could 13 independent colonies be brought together into a single nation and form a national government? After intense debate among the Founding Fathers, the answer would come in the writing of the United States Constitution and the Bill of Rights. The shot heard around the world initiating the Revolutionary War was still a year away, but the transition from British citizen to American was nearly complete when a delegation from the colonies met in Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress. It would be the first of many meetings in this historic city, eventually leading to the writing of the Constitution.
Elected representatives from 12 of the 13 colonies met from September 5th to October 26th here at Philadelphia's Carpenter Hall. These representatives formed a Congress that would essentially govern America for the next 15 years. It was 1774, and though the delegates were not entirely clear as to the First Continental Congress's ultimate purpose, in retrospect they inaugurated the United States of America. In response to the Boston Tea Party, the British Parliament enacted a series of provocative laws dubbed the Intolerable Acts by the colonists. This legislation punished Boston and re-established British authority over the entire colony. The last, and most inflammatory act, required that colonists quarter British troops in their homes. At the opening of the First Continental Congress, Patrick Henry, delegate from Virginia, addressed the delegates with these electrifying words.
The distinctions between Virginians, Pennsylvanians, New Yorkers, and New Englanders are no more. I am not a Virginian, but an American.
By the time Congress adjourned, resolutions were passed opposing the Intolerable Acts, and 10 colonial rights were spelled out, including the right to life, liberty, and property. When the delegates to the Congress, such as Sam Adams, John Adams, and George Washington, left Carpenter Hall, the American colonies had acted as a single nation for the first time. While these men of vision and talent waited for the British response to their proclamations, the fight had already begun as troops from both sides moved for advantage.
In 1776, the Revolutionary War was raging. There was no turning back for the colonists. In July of that year, the Declaration of Independence from Britain was announced to the world. In that document was expressed the philosophical basis of the United States Constitution, that all men are created equal, and that they have certain civil rights that no government can take away. They are inalienable, given by the Creator. As it turned out, the Declaration of Independence was a stronger statement of the natural rights of men than was ever expressed in the United States Constitution or the Bill of Rights.
Today it is celebrated with great fanfare every July 4th. It is Independence Day for nearly 300 million Americans. However, unlike most revolutions, America's Independence Day celebrates not a bloody battle or the overthrow of a malevolent dictator or monarch. The American Independence Day celebrates an intellectual document, the Declaration of Independence. This document was the defining moment of American political thought and philosophy that American colonists had been striving toward since the French and Indian War. By the spring of 1776, opposition to American independence centered in the middle colonies of Pennsylvania, New York, New Jersey, and Maryland. However, by mid-May, those who still argued for allegiance to the king lost their influence.
Our petitions have not been heard, yet answered with fleets and armies. Sam Adams.
By the time the Continental Congress met in Philadelphia State House that June, the only question concerning independence left before the representatives was the timing. Should they wait for a groundswell from the people? Thomas Jefferson argued that Congress should act immediately.
The people wait for us to lead the way.
The representatives agreed that Congress should wait 3 weeks while delegates from the mid-Atlantic colonies shored up support for independence. Meanwhile, Congress appointed a committee led by Thomas Jefferson to write the document. The other members were Robert Livingston from New York, Roger Sherman from Connecticut, Benjamin Franklin from Pennsylvania, and John Adams from Massachusetts. By July 1st, they had a document that began with soaring phrases now taught to every American student. When in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them. A decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. On July 1st, the committee presented the document to Congress. Representatives debated it for 4 days. Little was changed except that a long passage which blamed Negro slavery on the king was eliminated. On July 4th, the Declaration of Independence passed with no negative votes recorded against it. the 13 colonies unanimously declared themselves independent of Great Britain. The celebration began as it was read to a throng of people outside of the State House. Great celebrations of joy followed throughout the colonies, but the war had still to be won.
1786. The Revolutionary War had been over for 5 years. However, the new nation of the United States of America was adrift, and it was headed down the path of becoming one more corrupt and unjust government. Shays' Rebellion proved to be the wake-up call.
I hold it that a little rebellion now and then is a good thing. It is the medicine necessary for the sound health of government. God forbid that we should ever be 20 years without such a rebellion. Thomas Jefferson, January 30th, 1787.
When Thomas Jefferson wrote those words, he referred to an uprising of western Massachusetts farmers in the fall of 1786. Led by a former Continental Army captain, Daniel Shays, these angry farmers took control of the Springfield, Massachusetts County Courthouse from September 25th through the 28th. More hostilities followed. The problem was that politicians in Boston were behaving much like their former British masters, imposing unfair property and polling taxes, perverting the legal system, and capitalizing on an unstable currency. The result was that heroes who fought for independence were losing their farms and being thrown into debtor prison. The new country was at a critical moment in history. Would it go down the path of one more corrupt and malevolent government, or would something new and grand emerge?
No morning ever dawned more favorable than ours did, and no day was ever more clouded than the present. Wisdom and good examples are necessary at this time to rescue the political machine from the impending storm.
Eventually, Massachusetts militia put down Shays' Rebellion. Shays and most of his men received amnesty, but no event better dramatized the need for a strong national government to ensure justice and domestic tranquility, the need for a new U.S. Constitution, and the need to spell out the rights of every citizen, to protect those rights always. In the summer of 1787, that new government would take form.
By 1787, the United States had been governed for 6 years by the Articles of Confederation. Shays' Rebellion and the fact that the states were acting as individual countries made it clear to the Founding Fathers that they needed to create a new nation. A nation with a stronger national government. The paradox was how to create that powerful federal government while at the same time restricting its power. James Madison, known as the father of the Constitution, came up with a brilliant solution. He established a system of checks and balances so that no one branch of the federal government could become all-powerful.
It was a daring move like none before or since. These men and women of the United States were about to replace their old government with a new one, and do so without a single shot being fired. By 1787, most of the country recognized that the Articles of Confederation enacted in 1777 could not solve the problems facing the new nation. Under the Articles, the United States government had no independent power of taxation. It was unable to deal with incursions by the British and Spanish into its territories, and it could not regulate commerce between the various states. The United States behaved more like a group of petty nations than a single powerful country. In 1787, the Congress sanctioned the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia's Independence Hall. Chaired by George Washington and including the elderly Ben Franklin and youthful James Madison, its mission was to create a new governmental structure. Throughout the long, hot summer, this extraordinary gathering of talent debated resolution after resolution, honing the structure of a representative government until on September 17th, the delegates approved the U.S. Constitution. The preamble began, "We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America." 7 articles followed. The central feature of the new Constitution, and its most brilliant design, was its separation of powers into 3 branches of government: executive, legislative, and judicial, all of them interlocked in a system of checks and balances. Article 1 established a bicameral, or 2-part legislature, with a House of Representatives based on proportional representation and a Senate based on equal representation. It also provided that the states determined the manner in which members would be elected. The article went on to list the powers of the Congress, including the power to lay and collect taxes, borrow money, regulate commerce, and provide for the common defense. Only the 2 houses of Congress could initiate legislation, and the article detailed how a bill became law. Article 2 established the executive branch of government. Both the president and the vice president had to be 35 years of age and natural-born American citizens. The president was the commander-in-chief of the army and the state's militias. With the advice and consent of the Senate, he was empowered to make treaties with other nations and choose judges. To balance the power of Congress, he was given the authority to veto bills. Finally, the article provided for the removal of the president. Article 3 vested the judicial power of the United States in one Supreme Court and directed Congress to establish such lesser courts as needed. It also defined what cases could be handled by the federal judiciary and stipulated that all crimes except impeachment shall be by jury. Article 4 stipulated that each state shall honor the public acts, records, and judicial proceedings of every other state. For example, a marriage in one state must be recognized by all states. The framers, understanding that the document would have to be improved from time to time to reflect a changing and growing nation, wrote Article 5 in order to establish procedures for amending the Constitution. Article 6 made the Constitution the supreme law of the land. It also enumerated the United States' responsibilities and required that all federal officers take an oath of allegiance to the United States and the Constitution. Article 7 outlined the manner of ratification of the Constitution, stating that 9 states shall be sufficient for the establishment of this Constitution. Over the next year, the people of the various states in their own conventions debated and voted on the proposed Constitution. During this time, constitutional advocates Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay wrote the Federalist Papers, which laid out a defense for the necessity of a strong federal government as proposed by the new Constitution. On June 21st, 1788, New Hampshire became the 9th state to ratify the Constitution, and with that, the bold new experiment in self-government was about to begin.
At the core of the United States Constitution, penned in 1787, is the restriction of the federal government's power through a system of checks and balances. What is not represented in the document is the philosophy of the natural rights of man, contained in the Declaration of Independence. Many representatives at the Constitutional Convention wanted explicit protection of these rights before ratifying the new Constitution. It would be up to a proposed Bill of Rights to address these concerns.
When the Founding Fathers met here in Philadelphia's Independence Hall to create a new federal government for the United States, all the delegates understood that such a step was necessary. But how much power that government should have was much debated. Having won a war which gave them freedom, the right to own property, and the right of self-government, the question remained: what could they do to ensure that each successive generation of Americans would also have those same rights and freedoms? What they settled upon was a representative form of democracy. Already the country had grown to such a size, nearly 4 million inhabitants, that a true democracy was impractical. So they set up 3 branches within the federal government: executive, legislative, and judicial, and distributed power amongst the 3 branches so that they formed an interlocking system of checks and balances. The details were written by James Madison. The document was called the Constitution. But this document by itself was not enough for some states to ratify the Constitution as the basis of America's new federal government. The Anti-Federalists, men who opposed a strong central government, wanted even more checks on the power that they were creating to rule the nation. These Anti-Federalists, led by prominent men like Patrick Henry, Thomas Paine, and George Mason, author of the Virginia Bill of Rights, opposed a strong national government. They wanted the rights of the people protected. They wanted these rights, such as the free exercise of religion, freedom of speech and press, and protection against unreasonable searches and seizures, written down and made part of the nation's governing document. As stated in the Declaration of Independence, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they were endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The Anti-Federalists insisted upon a Declaration of Rights that derived not from government, but instead were the natural rights of all the people independent of the government. To satisfy these concerns and ensure ratification of the new Constitution, a Bill of Rights, a Declaration of Human Rights, or as they are now called, Fundamental Civil Rights, was promised. In the summer of 1788, a proposed draft of the Bill of Rights was circulated among the states. Many of these fundamental rights derived from abuses of power that the colonists suffered under oppressive British rule. In 1690, the first colonial newspaper, Boston's Public Occurrences, was suppressed after one issue. In 1760, Founding Father James Otis argued against illegal searches conducted by British soldiers. From 1765 throughout the Revolutionary War, colonists were forced against their will to house these same soldiers in their homes. In 1775, British troops marched on Lexington and Concord to confiscate colonial arms and ammunition. British authorities did not always allow colonists the same rights of due process or speedy trials that Englishmen were guaranteed. And colonists faced excessive bails and cruel and unusual punishments. The colonists had fought the Revolutionary War to end these abuses, to protect the civil liberties of the American citizens, and to make it impossible for these rights to be taken away by whim or by the tyranny of the majority or the minority. With the proposed Bill of Rights, most of the Anti-Federalists were satisfied that the people's fundamental rights would be safeguarded. As a result, the Constitution was ratified unanimously. Since their adoption, these amendments have done their job. Americans in the 21st century still have as much freedom and as many rights, perhaps even more, than the Founding Fathers.
The one Founding Father who could not hold high national office, because he was not a native-born American, was Alexander Hamilton. Yet he paved the way for the nation to use its newly achieved freedom to prosper economically. In a series of brilliant economic moves within the constitutional framework, he laid out how the federal government would relate to American business.
As the last decade of the 18th century opened, America's colonial period had come to an end. The new nation had a remarkable constitution, and its growing population was expanding westward into the lush Ohio Valley. But one crucial question remained. What kind of economic structure would the United States embrace? One person almost single-handedly provided the answer. He was Alexander Hamilton. On September 11th, 1789, George Washington named Alexander Hamilton the nation's first Secretary of the Treasury. For the next 6 years, Hamilton would define the country's economic and fiscal policies and create its financial institutions. Hamilton began quickly, and in 1790 launched an ambitious plan for handling the nation's debt, which included assumption by the federal government of the state's war costs. His second step was to create the Bank of the United States, which became the mechanism for establishing credit for the country. Next, in 1791, and through the tireless campaigning of Noah Webster, under Hamilton's guidance, Congress passed a Copyright and Patent Act to protect American inventors. In that same year, Hamilton presented a report to Congress which urged tariffs on foreign imports to protect American industry and agriculture. He also recommended that the federal government support road and canal construction to provide the infrastructure necessary to enhance the economy. Finally, in 1792, the United States Mint was established and a uniformed coinage produced. As a corollary to Hamilton's federal plans, in 1792, the New York Stock Exchange was organized by friends of Hamilton to fund new business. Hamilton envisioned a United States diverse in manufacturing and, in his own words, independent of foreign nations for military and other essential supplies. By the time he left the Treasury in 1795, the country had taken all the steps necessary to join the Industrial Revolution. Hamilton's vision would win out over the Jeffersonian agricultural utopia, and America would go on to become the greatest industrial power in the world. Ironically, Alexander Hamilton would lose his life over these values. In 1804, he died as a result of gunshot wounds inflicted in a duel with his old political nemesis, Aaron Burr.
In this final segment, the Bill of Rights is laid out.
The U.S. Constitution, written in 1787, laid out a unique structure for a strong central government. But it also left open the door for tyranny by that government. Fresh in the minds of Americans of that time was the loss of their civil rights during British rule. In fact, many of the states consented to ratify the Constitution only with the provision that there would be a Bill of Rights for U.S. citizens. To fulfill this obligation, James Madison drafted the Bill of Rights and presented it to the Congress on June 8, 1789. In 1791, they were ratified by the states and became the law of the land. In recent years, the First and Second Amendments have become the most controversial issues of the Constitution. Amendment 1. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or the right of people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. Amendment 2. A well-regulated militia, being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. The Fourth Amendment safeguarded the right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures, except with a search warrant issued upon probable cause. The Fifth Amendment, arguably the most prominent of them all, protected citizens from forfeiting life, liberty, or property without due process in the courts. It also provided safeguards against being tried for the same crime twice, forcing a defendant to testify against her or himself, and from property being confiscated for public use without proper compensation. The Sixth Amendment guaranteed a speedy trial, an impartial jury, and the right to confront witnesses, and the right to a lawyer. Other amendments forbade the quartering of troops in private homes during peacetime and excessive bail and cruel or unusual punishments. Lastly, and perhaps most importantly to the framers of the Constitution. Amendments 9 and 10 guarantee to the people those rights not specifically enumerated in the Constitution. Oddly, the drafter of these rights, James Madison, originally opposed the Bill of Rights because he feared that by listing them, others not explicitly named would be denied to citizens. But time has shown that the Bill of Rights has become the cornerstone of America's much heralded freedom.
In the fourth episode of A History of the United States Constitution, the new government of the United States and its governing document will be severely tested. Could the grand vision laid out in the Constitution and the Bill of Rights work in practice? I'm Jeff Fahey, and thanks for watching.
It is one of the world's most sacred documents. It is a product of the eternal search for liberty and freedom. It reflects the times during which it was conceived, and at the same time, it has been a guide to an unknown and rapidly changing future. It is the United States of America's Constitution. In this series, we shall see how this document has served to shelter the American people from the abuses of power and tyranny. How for over 2 centuries the U.S. Constitution has empowered Americans to excel and aspire to greatness. Great art, great literature, excellence and leadership in science and technology. And how the Constitution has allowed the United States to become the most prosperous and most powerful nation the planet has ever seen.
Hi, I'm Jeff Fahey, and welcome to the fourth episode of A History of the United States Constitution. During the 10 years following the ratification of the Bill of Rights, the Constitution and the government it established would be tested on every front. The federal government's power would be tested by the states' rights advocates. The powers of the presidency would be tested by the judiciary. The Constitution would be tested to see if it could survive modification. And most importantly, the Constitution would be tested to see if it was the law of the whole nation. Congress had the responsibility for shaping the details laid out only vaguely in the United States Constitution. It fulfilled its duty in a series of congressional acts. The most notorious was the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793.
In the 21st century, the reverberations from the arrival of the first black slaves to the Jamestown colony in 1619 have not subsided. The greatest failure of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights is that they did not end slavery. In fact, the Constitution began a process that would nearly tear the country apart. The northern and mid-Atlantic states understood the hypocrisy of fighting a war of freedom and at the same time owning slaves. By the end of the Revolutionary War, those states had abolished involuntary servitude. But the southern states had no qualms about continuing slavery. Charles Pinckney of South Carolina defended the South's peculiar institution warmly.
In all ages, 1/2 of mankind have been slaves.
John Rutledge of Virginia was more direct.
North and South Carolina and Georgia would never agree to a new constitution unless their right to import slaves be untouched. The people of those states will never be such fools as give up so important an interest.
The southern plantation owners realized that northern states would become safe havens for runaway slaves, and they demanded a provision in the Constitution that required northern states treat slaves as criminals to be extradited back to their state of origin. Article 4, Section 2 of the United States Constitution declared that persons held to service or labor, a euphemism for slavery, in one state escaping into another shall be delivered up on claim of the party to whom such service or labor may be due. However, the Constitution did not set up a mechanism for carrying out the law. The result was that in 1793, Congress passed a law called the Fugitive Slave Act that outlined how Article 4, Section 2 would be executed. Although the law was largely ineffectual, it began a process that would split the nation apart 68 years later in the Civil War that would be the bloodiest war in American history. Though the war's outcome would cement the nation back together, it did not end the schism between North and South, black and white, a schism which still haunts the United States today.
As mandated by the United States Constitution, the Federal Judiciary Act of 1789 created the nation's federal court system and structured the Supreme Court. Almost immediately, a Supreme Court decision expanded federal power over the states. It brought on the first constitutional crisis, as the decision was challenged by representatives from the various states. The first addition to the United States Constitution, the 11th Amendment, would renounce that Supreme Court decision. However, in the end, the amendment provision in the Constitution worked, and the Republic survived.
Three years after ratification of the Bill of Rights, the Constitution was amended for the first time. The 11th Amendment was proposed and adopted by Congress at lightning speed. The language itself was esoteric and obtuse, and has led to inconsistent judicial interpretations and decisions.
11th Amendment. The judicial power of the United States shall not be construed to extend to any suit in law or equity commenced or prosecuted against one of the United States by citizens of another state or by citizens or subjects of any foreign state.
Yet in spite of its vagaries, the 11th Amendment goes to the heart of who has authority between the United States and the individual states, and the states amongst each other. From the start, America's early settlers established courts in each of the colonies. These courts remained when the colonies became states. In 1776, after issuing the Declaration of Independence, the states acted as if they were 13 sovereign nations with 13 independent jurisdictions. 11 years later, the advocates of states' rights, the Anti-Federalists, wanted to preserve as much of that sovereignty as possible when drafting a federal constitution. However, all the Constitution's framers knew that compromise was necessary. For example, disputes between the states might lead to intense conflict, even war. So a federal arbiter of such disputes was necessary, and individual states had to be bound by a national foreign policy. Nevertheless, the battle between states' rights versus federal rights started early and has never really abated. Indeed, the battle began with the first act of the first Congress. It was the Judiciary Act of 1789. The Constitution's Article 3, which established the United States judicial power, was vague. As a result, Congress needed to be specific in establishing a strong federal court system, one which transferred legal authority from the states to the federal government, one with the ability to review and overturn state court decisions if necessary. The Judiciary Act did just that. It set the number of justices in the Supreme Court at 6. It also affirmed that the Supreme Court could settle disputes between states. It set up a system of 13 lower federal courts, without which the Supreme Court could not have practically been able to assert its authority. And the act put forth the ideal that has served the nation well. The Supreme Court had final say on legal matters federal and state. In 1789, the Supreme Court opened for business. Its first Chief Justice was John Jay, a major proponent of a strong federal government. 4 years later, the Supreme Court made its first controversial ruling, a ruling that would bring about the 11th Amendment. During the Revolutionary War, the state of Georgia had run up a debt to a South Carolina merchant, Robert Farquhar. After the war, Georgia refused to pay the merchant because he was a British loyalist. However, after Farquhar's death, the executor of the estate, a Mr. Chisholm, and a South Carolina resident, brought a suit to the Supreme Court demanding payment. Georgia claimed it had sovereign immunity, but the Supreme Court ruled it did not, and in Chisholm v. Georgia, ordered Georgia to pay. Georgia legislators were outraged and were soon supported by other states. Once the next Congress convened, one of its first matters of business was to amend the Constitution to stop any more Georgia v. Chisholm-type cases. In 1794, the 11th Amendment was proposed. It was ratified 4 years later. Quickly, the 11th Amendment was liberally interpreted to mean that states had sovereign immunity and could not be sued by their own citizens or citizens from another state. It also brought up a question that would trouble the nation until the Civil War. Who was sovereign? States' governments or the national government? The Civil War would answer that question in favor of the national government. Since the Civil War, one by one, the states have given up their claim to sovereign immunity.
In response to the Whiskey Rebellion, the power of the federal government would be put to the test for the first time. Rather than administering severe punishment to the protesters, George Washington and the federal government showed leniency. A profound precedent was set. A free people could tolerate protests, even rebellion, and survive. Survive without giving up ideals expressed in the United States Constitution.
In the summer of 1794, George Washington, now President and Commander-in-Chief of the newly formed United States, once again took the reins of a 12,000-man army. The enemy? A group of farmers near Pittsburgh who turned surplus grain into whiskey. Accompanying Washington on the march into western Pennsylvania was his Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton. The reason for the federal government's impressive display of force wasn't a moral objection to alcohol, but the fact that the farmers refused to pay a steep federal liquor tax initiated by Hamilton. In 1791, Alexander Hamilton had pushed through Congress a 25% excise tax on whiskey to be collected at the source. Federal tax collectors had to face these frontier farmers, known as the Whiskey Boys, on their own lands. Over the next 3 years, confrontations between the farmers and the tax collectors grew more and more violent, until a large portion of western Pennsylvania was in revolt against the tax. When Washington and his troops arrived, the troublemakers dispersed and the rebellion disintegrated. Accommodations were made with the ringleaders. But the significance of the Whiskey Rebellion and the federal government's intervention was that a precedent was set. By being lenient with the Whiskey Boys, the new federal government showed its capacity to rule resolutely, but with mercy. Over the next 200 years, the seemingly limitless freedom of American society would from time to time lead to violent protests and rebellions. In 1863, Irish immigrants and U.S. citizens rioted against the new draft initiated by Lincoln. A strike at Pittsburgh Homestead Steel Mill in 1892 led to bloodshed and was finally put down by the Pennsylvania militia. In 1932, at the height of the Depression, veterans marched on Washington, D.C. General Douglas MacArthur, on orders from President Hoover, crushed the protest. The infamous summer of 1965 saw America's inner cities torn apart with riots from Los Angeles to Detroit to Miami. And by the end of the decade, nationwide protests against the Vietnam War, often put down brutally by police and soldiers, would end American participation in the conflict. But these protests and rebellions did not tear the country apart. In fact, often they made the country stronger, showing the true value of freedom.
When the framers wrote the United States Constitution, it never occurred to them that they themselves would evolve into opposing political parties, but they did. As a result, the nation had to survive a president from one party, John Adams, and a vice president from another party, Thomas Jefferson. Once again, the new nation passed the test. Such future conflicts were removed by the 12th Amendment.
In 1796, when George Washington declared 2 terms as president was enough, a great fear welled up in the hearts and minds of many Americans over the upcoming election. Washington had been a mythic figure, and his retirement inevitably produced a question of succession, as in England when a king died. Many predicted that the country would be torn apart by the political strife between Federalists and Republicans.
I fear the country is not sufficiently united to make a choice by the electors. Oliver Wolcott, Secretary of the Treasury.
While Washington had stood above politics in the minds of many Americans, those who served under him, like Alexander Hamilton, John Adams, and Thomas Jefferson, directed strong party factions that opposed each other ideologically. Led by Hamilton and Adams, the Federalists thought a strong national government was the only way the United States could survive. Republicans, led by Jefferson and Madison, believed in states' rights and a limited central government. Hamilton saw a strong national government as the means to make the separate states into a powerful nation. While Adams had fought bravely and tirelessly for freedom from Britain, he believed that America should follow British ideals in government. Jefferson's republic beliefs were based upon his faith in an agrarian utopia. More practical than Jefferson, Madison feared a strong federal government would coerce the states into making laws that were to their own detriment. The result was that in a few short years, a two-party system emerged which pitted the heroes of America's fight for freedom against each other, an event the framers of the Constitution never foresaw. Partisan politics came to a head in the election of 1796 when Adams was elected president and Jefferson, his opposition, was elected vice president. This juxtaposition produced an uncomfortable situation that would be remedied in 1803, when the 12th Amendment designated that both executive officers would be from the same party.
12th Amendment. The electors shall meet in their respective states and vote by ballot for president and vice president. They shall name in their ballots the person voted for as president, and in distinct ballots the person voted for as vice president.
However, since the election of 1796, the two-party system has become the primary form of political debate in the United States. Over the next 200 years, the parties themselves would change ideals and principles and, at times, even names. Until in the 21st century, Republicans and Democrats battled just as Adams and Jefferson did over 200 years ago. But most importantly, the transition of power in 1796 took place smoothly, as it has ever since, demonstrating that the fears of the '96 election were unfounded.
Next, we will see how the people of the United States rose up to protect the First Amendment.
As the 18th century was coming to a close, the nation experienced its first crisis in freedom, a freedom it had wrested from Great Britain 17 years earlier, freedom of press and speech. The framers of the Constitution understood that monarchs and tyrannies maintained power by prohibiting any criticism of their rule. So the framers explicitly provided for open criticism of the government through the First Amendment. Still, there have always been those tempted to abuse the power of the federal government. The first time arose in 1798 after France and Britain had renewed their centuries-old conflict. The Federalists sided with Britain and the Republicans supported France. Led by John Adams, the Federalists attempted to restrict criticism aimed at their policies by their Republican rivals. In the summer of 1798, a Federalist-dominated Congress passed some of the most repressive measures ever enacted by the U.S. government. 2 alien acts directly targeted immigrants thought to be sympathetic with Republican ideals, making it harder for those aliens to become citizens and giving the president power to deport anyone considered dangerous to the welfare of the country. The Sedition Act directly targeted Republican political activity. The act fined and imprisoned anyone conspiring with any intent to oppose any laws of the government or presenting opposition through
printing, writing, or speaking in a scandalous or malicious way against the government of the United States, either House of Congress or the President, with the purpose of bringing them into contempt.
The majority of the American public so roundly hated the Alien and Sedition Acts that they turned the Federalists out of office by electing Thomas Jefferson in 1800. The new Republican government, led by Jefferson, repealed the Alien Acts and allowed the Sedition Act to expire, ending a dark era in American history. However, Americans would now have to be ever vigilant, especially in wartime, as many attempts would be made by Congress and the presidency to restrict individual freedom. These have included the Espionage Act of 1917, the War Powers Act of 1941, and the Patriot Act of 2001.
After the rebuff of the Supreme Court by the 11th Amendment, it appeared that the balance of power envisioned by the framers would not come to pass because of a weak judicial system. That is, until John Marshall fulfilled the vision of the framers by making the Supreme Court the final word on everything constitutional.
Today, when Americans think of the founding fathers of the United States, they think of these men: George Washington, commander of the Continental Army and first president; John Adams, a delegate to the First Continental Congress and second president; Thomas Jefferson, author of the Declaration of Independence and third president; James Madison, author of the Constitution and fourth president; and Benjamin Franklin, signer of the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and the peace treaty that ended the Revolutionary War. However, a sixth man should be added to that cadre of the Founding Fathers, a man who already has his own Washington, D.C. memorial, the Supreme Court. He is John Marshall. John Marshall was born in colonial Virginia in 1755. At an early age, he read Shakespeare, Dryden, Cicero, and memorized Pope's Essay on Man, books that might have come from George Washington's library, as the Marshall family were close friends of the nation's first president. At the age of 17, John was given William Blackstone's Commentaries on the Law of England to read. From an early age, he was destined to become a lawyer. When the Revolutionary War broke out, Marshall joined the Virginia Minutemen and later the Continental Army, distinguishing himself in numerous battles. After the war, John Marshall began his practice as a lawyer. He was known for his brilliance and for his common sense. In 1783, he married Mary Ambler. Their 49-year relationship was a true American love story. As Marshall's law practice thrived, he became involved in Virginia politics, becoming the leader of its Federalist Party, the party of Adams and Hamilton, the advocates of a strong federal government. In 1788, Marshall, along with Patrick Henry, an ardent anti-federalist, was elected to Virginia's state convention to vote on ratification of the new Constitution. At the convention, the debate for or against a strong federal government centered on the power of Congress and the presidency. To the surprise of many, Marshall spoke out in favor of a powerful federal judiciary. A judiciary he claimed would be necessary to protect the civil rights and the self-government won in the Revolutionary War. In retrospect, he was defining what he himself would accomplish 47 years later. 10 years after the Constitution was ratified, Marshall won election to the House of Representatives. A year later, he became Secretary of State in John Adams's administration. When Adams lost the presidential election of 1800 to Jefferson, Adams appointed Marshall to be Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. By now, Marshall and Jefferson were bitter political opponents. Soon others of Adams's midnight judicial appointments would bring Jefferson and Marshall into direct confrontation. When Jefferson became president, he refused to honor a number of Adams's judicial appointments. 4 of the disgruntled appointees applied to the Supreme Court for a writ of mandamus, in order to force Jefferson's Secretary of State, James Madison, to honor Adams's appointments and deliver the commissions. The 1803 case became known as Marbury v. Madison. After the 11th Amendment weakened the Supreme Court's power, its reputation diminished. It commanded little respect, and no one wanted to serve in such an ineffectual branch of government. Indeed, if not for Marshall's brilliant decision in Marbury v. Madison, the Supreme Court may very well have been relegated to a weak third sister in the balance of power in Washington. Marshall knew the fate of the Supreme Court was in his hands and what he would decide in Marbury v. Madison. The problem was that if the court awarded Marbury a writ, Jefferson would ignore it, and the court's authority would be further weakened. And if the court denied the writ, it would appear that the justices acted out of fear. Marshall was between a rock and a hard place. His solution was brilliant. In his opinion, Marshall stated that Madison should have delivered the commission to William Marbury. At the same time, however, he held that the section of the Judiciary Act of 1789 that gave the Supreme Court power to issue writs of mandamus exceeded the authority allotted the court under Article 3 of the Constitution, and was therefore null and void. The ruling changed the power of the court and brought it into equality with the other 2 branches of the government. In one stroke, Marshall established the court's power to declare acts of Congress, and by implication, acts of the President, unconstitutional if they exceeded the powers granted by the Constitution. Even more importantly, the court became the umpire of the Constitution, the final authority on interpreting what the document intended and meant. Then over the next 32 years until his death in 1835, Marshall, through his vast body of legal decisions, elevated the status of the Chief Justice to a level comparable to the Speaker of the House and the President. The Marshall Court would be followed by other strong Supreme Courts: the Taney Court, 1836 to 1864, the Warren Court, 1953 to 1969, the Burger Court, 1969 through 1986, and the Rehnquist Court, beginning in 1986. Many legislators and presidents have loathed the precedent set by Marshall, but no one can deny the constitutional and political power wielded by the Supreme Court throughout the history of the United States.
In the 5th episode of A History of the United States Constitution, We will see how the freedom generated in the United States Constitution empowered the nation to great economic heights, only to encounter the greatest constitutional crisis the nation would ever face, the Civil War. I'm Jeff Fahey, and thanks for watching.
It is one of the world's most sacred documents. It is a product of the eternal search for liberty and freedom. It reflects the times during which it was conceived, and at the same time, it has been a guide to an unknown and rapidly changing future. It is the United States of America's Constitution. In this series, we shall see how this document has served to shelter the American people from the abuses of power and tyranny. How for over 2 centuries the U.S. Constitution has empowered Americans to excel and aspire to greatness. Great art, great literature, excellence and leadership in science and technology. And how the Constitution has allowed the United States to become the most prosperous and most powerful nation the planet has ever seen.
During the middle of the 20th century, the Constitution faced a new challenge. Could the 150-year-old governing document still be relevant in a world totally transformed from that of the Founding Fathers? Hi, I'm Jeff Fahey. In the 7th episode of A History of the United States Constitution, we will see how fundamental rights are extended to minorities, and how the federal government gains powers in ways the Constitution's framers could never have imagined. By the early 20th century, a debate had been joined. Were the freedoms stated in the Bill of Rights absolute, or were they conditional? A famous, or some might say infamous, Supreme Court decision in 1919 ruled that they were conditional, that during times of national emergency, the right of free speech had limits.
In America's most treasured document, the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, and Benjamin Franklin asserted the doctrine of natural rights. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. In writing this powerful statement, these men capitalized the words Creator and rights. In doing so, they made certain the world would know these rights came from divine grace, and therefore were not granted by the King or Parliament. It was upon this foundation that the Constitution and the Bill of Rights were built. It was upon this foundation that the civil rights of every American rested. Rights that were absolute. Rights that no government could take away. Yet, 143 years later, in the controversial case Schenck v. U.S., the U.S. Supreme Court would weigh the sanctity of those rights against the country's security in a time of war, and declare that the rights were conditional, not absolute. The court's 1919 decision would shock the country and cast ripples through America for the rest of the century. In 1917, the United States shed its isolationism and entered World War I. As a result, in 1917, Congress passed the Espionage Act, making it a crime to cause or attempt to cause insubordination, disloyalty, mutiny, or refusal of duty in the military forces of the United States. In no time at all, war protesters tested that law. Charles T. Schenck, Secretary of the Socialist Party, produced a pamphlet which urged young men drafted into the U.S. Army for the war against Germany to oppose the draft and the war itself. Even though the document did not explicitly advocate resistance to the draft, Schenck was arrested under the Espionage Act of 1917 and convicted for attempting to cause insubordination in the armed forces and obstructing recruitment enlistment by mailing his pamphlet to these young men. He appealed his case on the First Amendment rights of free speech. The Supreme Court upheld the conviction. Speaking for the court, Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes admitted that, in ordinary times, Schenck's words might have been within his constitutional rights. The extraordinary times in which they were made, however, clearly placed his activities in the wrong. Holmes wrote, "The character of every act depends upon the circumstances in which it is done." He then went on to say, "The most stringent protection of free speech would not protect a person in falsely shouting fire in the theater and causing a panic. The question in every case is whether the words used are used in such circumstances and are of such a nature as to create a clear and present danger that will bring about the substantive evils that Congress has a right to prevent." With the Supreme Court's decision, the weighing of one emotionally charged constitutional right against another began in earnest. The right of free speech against the security of the state and its citizens. Curiously, the Vietnam War produced a diametrically opposed position in the case of the Pentagon Papers. During the war, in 1971, Daniel Ellsberg released to the New York Times documents that came to be known as the Pentagon Papers, called The History of United States Decision-Making Process on Vietnam Policy. The federal government appealed to the Supreme Court to stop publication. The court denied the government's request. Justices Hugo Black and William Douglas, in their concurring view, wrote, "Our government was launched in 1789 with the adoption of the Constitution. The Bill of Rights, including the First Amendment, followed in 1791. Now, for the first time in the 182 years since the founding of the Republic, the federal courts are asked to hold that the First Amendment does not mean what it says, but rather means that the government can halt the publication of current news of vital importance to the people of this country. Both the history and language of the First Amendment support the view that the press must be left free to publish news, whatever the source, without censorship, injunctions, or prior restraints."
I can no longer cooperate in concealing this information from the American public.
In the 21st century, the American political landscape appeared to change fundamentally with the threat of sabotage and terrorism aimed at the U.S., and with the World Trade Center and the Pentagon attacks of 9/11/2001. As a result, Congress passed the Patriot Act, which gave the federal government more power in searching out and finding terrorists in the United States. Once more, the country had to decide if its defense of liberties was equal to its desire for security.
Remarkably, it took 131 years for over one-half of Americans to become bona fide citizens under the Constitution, even to participate democratically in the United States system of self-government. In 1870, the 15th Amendment made it legal for black males to vote, but it was still illegal for women to vote until the 19th Amendment.
The words are old, drafted 42 years earlier. It was a long time coming, but with these words, the other half of America became legitimate citizens.
19th Amendment. The right of the citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex.
The most basic right of all Americans is the right to vote. Yet for nearly a century and a half after the founding of the nation, 50% of the population was denied that right. In 1848, the first Women's Rights Convention was held at Seneca Falls, New York. Led by such indomitable women as Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, they adopted a statement paraphrasing the Declaration of Independence. After listing women's specific grievances, the statement closed with a demand that women have immediate admission to all the rights and privileges which belong to them as citizens of the United States. In 1878, the amendment giving women the right to vote was introduced in Congress for the first time and defeated. From then on, tactics became more militant and suffragettes organized parades, silent vigils, hunger strikes, and in some cases, violence. Women often encountered fierce resistance as opponents heckled, jailed, and sometimes physically abused them. June 4th, 1919, Congress passed the 19th Amendment, and Tennessee became the 36th state to ratify it on August 18, 1920. With its confirmation, women went through a psychological transformation of empowerment. A second women's rights movement began in the 60s. Women demanded equality in education and in the business world. They demanded parity in athletics, and in 1969, Title IX was passed, providing that women's athletic teams in universities and colleges receiving federal money must have facilities and scholarships commensurate with men's teams. By the end of the 20th century, women achieved breakthroughs in high-profile positions such as authors, tennis players, legislators, and Supreme Court justices. The work started 155 years ago in upstate New York is yet to be completed.
The freedoms contained in the United States Constitution had made America the land of opportunity, especially economic opportunity. However, that opportunity produced a capitalistic society that also produced excesses and social disasters. Monopolies controlled whole industries, and millions of people were left out of America's economic success. Social activists called for the federal government to provide remedies. To do this, the federal government needed more power. From Teddy Roosevelt to Franklin Delano Roosevelt, presidents added to the power of the federal government, sometimes unconstitutionally.
When Democrat Franklin Delano Roosevelt took the presidential oath of office on March 4, 1933, the country had plummeted into the worst economic depression it would ever face. Unemployment at 50%, grid lines blocks long, over 5,000 bank failures, a vast stock market collapse, and thousands of farm foreclosures. The year before, President Hoover and congressional Republicans were at a loss about how to fix the country's ills. In stark contrast, FDR's inaugural speech delivered a message of hope and change, a New Deal. And in the same year, 2 constitutional amendments drove home that message of hope and change. The 20th and 21st Amendments heralded a new way of thinking in American life, a way of thinking that did away with obsolete traditions, did away with the old economic doctrine of non-government interference, and implemented government regulation of the economy. It was a way of thinking that is still hotly debated by liberals and conservatives in the 21st century. The 20th Amendment acknowledged that population growth and technology had changed the United States in a fundamental way since the founding of the nation and the writing of the Constitution. In 1787, the United States had been a narrow strip of land along the Atlantic coast, connected by muddy, rutted, and unmaintained roads. By 1933, the U.S. had crossed the continent to the west coast and had annexed Hawaii and Alaska. Highways, automobiles, trains, and airplanes brought the country closer together. Innovations in communication and entertainment, telephone, telegraph, movies, radio, had brought citizens closer together. In 1933, the United States was fast losing its sectionalism and ethnic orientation. The 20th Amendment reflected the shrinking nature and unity of the country. In 1800, it had taken elected officials months to travel from their home states to the nation's capital, Washington, D.C. As a result, after elections in November, swearing-in ceremonies for the winners were not held until March of the following year. For nearly 4 months, outgoing presidents, vice presidents, senators, and representatives were lame ducks, office holders with virtually no power and nothing to do while waiting for their successors' inauguration. However, in 1933, elected officials could travel across the United States in a matter of days by train and hours by plane. The necessity of waiting 5 months for the inauguration was no longer necessary. So the dates were brought forward to January 20th for the president and vice president, and January 3rd for senators and representatives.
20th Amendment. Section 1. The terms of the President and Vice President shall end at noon on the 20th day of January, and the terms of Senators and Representatives at noon on the 3rd day of January. Section 2. The Congress shall assemble at least once in every year, and such meeting shall begin at noon on the 3rd day of January.
In 1933, the 21st Amendment ended America's attempt at social engineering through the Constitution. In 1919, Americans, flushed with the victory of World War I and riding a tide of progressivism that gave women the right to vote, embarked on a program of social engineering that had never been contemplated by the framers of the Constitution. Indeed, the framers had not seen fit to include social engineering in the U.S. Constitution and had left the enforcement of laws governing moral transgressions like adultery and alcoholism to the states. But the 18th Amendment changed all that. From 1920 to 1933, Prohibition, the noble experiment in social engineering, was the law of the land. By 1930, it was clear that Prohibition was a colossal failure. The Democrats came out for the repeal of Prohibition in the 1932 presidential campaign. Their overwhelming electoral victory paved the way for Congress to pass the 21st Amendment on February 20th, 1933. By December, the states ratified the amendment, and the 18th Amendment was repealed.
21st Amendment. The 18th Article of Amendment to the Constitution of the United States is hereby repealed.
Ironically, after the repeal of the 18th Amendment, America embarked on the greatest adventure of social engineering the nation would ever see with FDR's New Deal. Indeed, many of FDR's programs, such as the National Industrial Recovery Act and Farm Mortgage Relief, would be condemned as unconstitutional by the 1935 United States Supreme Court.
Americans instinctively understood that the president was becoming too powerful when they ratified the 22nd Amendment.
In 1933, the Depression had gripped America for 4 years. Millions were out of work, and the country was only a few steps from collapse into anarchy. But in that same year, the country embraced hope when a new president, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, was sworn into office. 18 years and 4 terms later, the United States had beaten back economic collapse, won World War II, and become the world's greatest superpower with atomic weapons to back up its claim. But at the same time in 1951, the people amended the Constitution again for only the 22nd time, limiting the country's chief executive to 2 terms in office. Ironically, though FDR had brought the nation through the desperate times of depression and war, he would be the reason for the 22nd Amendment to the Constitution of the United States. Franklin Delano Roosevelt ran for president 4 times and won handily each time. The American people loved him. He gave them hope and strong leadership when it was needed. But by 1947, many felt FDR's ambition to lead the country had also been an abuse of power. Even supporters believed he had overstepped the tradition of 2 terms established by the nation's first president, George Washington. As a result, a majority of Americans felt it was important to refine the Constitution again and limit the nation's chief executive to 2 terms in office. Though thankful for FDR's leadership, they feared unfettered power in any one leader. So on March 12, 1947, the Congress passed the 22nd Amendment, limiting presidents from Harry Truman on to 2 terms. It was ratified by the states on March 1, 1951.
22nd Amendment. No person shall be elected to the office of the President more than twice, and no person who has held the office of President or acted as President for more than 2 years of a term to which some other person was elected President shall be elected to the office of the President more than once.
In Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas, the separate but equal Jim Crow laws were finally abolished in education. This decision marked the beginning of a new activist role for the Supreme Court, one which also brought the Supreme Court into balance with the power of the other 2 branches of the federal government.
By the second half of the 20th century, individual blacks in America had made great strides and demonstrated excellence in every walk of life. But for the average African American, little had changed since the Civil War. Equal opportunity in education, work, politics, and housing was non-existent. In the 1950s, this was about to change. The 14th Amendment guaranteed blacks all the rights and privileges of citizens under the Constitution. However, in its infamous 1896 Plessy v. Ferguson decision, the Supreme Court interpreted these rights and privileges to mean separate but equal. This decision essentially validated Jim Crow laws that made the United States a segregated society. The result was that blacks were given substandard school buildings with second-rate supplies. But with President Truman's executive order desegregating the armed services in 1948, the tide began to shift.
There is no justifiable reason for discrimination because of ancestry, or religion, or race, or color.
The next step occurred in Topeka, the capital of Kansas. A black third grader named Linda Brown had to walk 1 mile through a railroad yard to get to her black elementary school, even though a white elementary school was only 7 blocks away. Linda's father tried to enroll her in the white elementary school, but the principal refused. It was the legal case the NAACP was looking for.
This is a part of the group of lawyers.
Future Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall argued the case and took it all the way to the Supreme Court in 1952. 2 years later, on May 17, 1954, Eisenhower appointee Supreme Court Chief Justice Earl Warren read the decision of the unanimous court. We conclude that in the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place. Separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. The decision did not apply to the separate but equal situation in any other part of society, but the civil rights movement had taken a giant step forward.
Finally, the citizens of the nation's capital were granted the right to vote in federal elections.
In the 21st century, Washington, D.C. is the most powerful capital city in the world. Here, decisions are made by the president that affect not only the citizens of the United States, but people all over the world. Yet for 170 years since the founding of the capital in 1790, the people living in Washington, D.C. were not allowed to exercise the most basic freedom of being an American, the right to vote for president and vice president. At the same time, they had all the responsibilities of citizenship, including paying taxes and being drafted. It was not until 1961 that Congress and the American people corrected this oversight. In 1787, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 17 of the nation's new Constitution provided for an independent district, uncontrolled by any state, to become the site of the nation's capital. Selected by George Washington, the country's leaders established the new capital along the Potomac River on land ceded to the federal government by Maryland and Virginia. The Congress called it the District of Columbia. By 1960, the population of Washington, D.C. exceeded more than 800,000 people, as large as the populations of Wyoming, Nevada, and Alaska combined. Yet its residents still could not vote in national elections because the Constitution restricted that privilege to citizens who resided in states. Then the United States Congress hit upon a compromise. Through the 23rd Amendment, the residents would be allowed to vote for electors of the president and vice president equal to the number of senators and representatives which the district would have if it were a state. However, the number would be equal to the nation's least populous state. In 1960, that was Alaska, with 226,000 residents. On April 3, 1961, the 23rd Amendment was ratified by the states, and the District of Columbia got 3 electors, equal to Alaska's 2 senators and 1 representative.
In the final episode of A History of the United States Constitution, the nation enters the highly charged television era of American politics, where constitutional issues are debated nightly. It's a time when Americans' civil rights guaranteed in the Bill of Rights are strengthened and extended, and the Constitution itself gains new appreciation by the citizens it governs. I'm Jeff Fahey, and thanks for watching.
It is one of the world's most sacred documents. It is a product of the eternal search for liberty and freedom. It reflects the times during which it was conceived, and at the same time, it has been a guide to an unknown and rapidly changing future. It is the United States of America's Constitution. In this series, we shall see how this document has served to shelter the American people from the abuses of power and tyranny. How for over 2 centuries the U.S. Constitution has empowered Americans to excel and aspire to greatness. Great art, great literature, excellence and leadership in science and technology. And how the Constitution has allowed the United States to become the most prosperous and most powerful nation the planet has ever seen.
Hi, I'm Jeff Fahey, and welcome to the 5th episode of A History of the United States Constitution. The men who wrote the Constitution were all well-educated, wealthy landowners. In fact, the Founding Fathers never trusted the masses to govern themselves responsibly. In this episode, we will learn how the freedoms and responsibilities set forth in the U.S. Constitution began the slow process of extending to all Americans. After the turn of the century, America truly did become the land of opportunity. There was so much land that everybody could own a piece of the country, and everybody could start his or her own business. The newly created wealth would push the nation across the continent all the way to the Pacific Ocean. However, this dramatic geographic expansion also expanded slavery until the United States reached its darkest moment, the Civil War. An early draft of the Declaration of Independence had the word property instead of happiness in the famous phrase, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The sanctity of property, of ownership, was foremost in the minds of the Constitution's framers. Under a monarchy, the king owned all the land and granted business opportunities to the chosen few. If property ownership was to be secure, and if a nation was going to become a country of independent entrepreneurs, contracts had to be given the full power of the law. They needed to be constitutionally guaranteed.
Today, every American is familiar with contracts, agreements between two or more parties enforceable by law. Signing up for a cell phone plan, buying a house or a car, working for a company, getting married. All of these activities have a contract between participants, a legal relationship. Each contract sets out the responsibilities of the participants. But most importantly, each contract is legal and binding, a fact that was firmly established at the beginning of the 19th century, when the sanctity of contracts was made the core of American enterprise. In two cases, the U.S. Supreme Court under Chief Justice John Marshall established that a contract was a contract was a contract. To Marshall, the inviolability of a contract meant property would be protected. Through the next 2 centuries, this notion evolved to mean that if a person broke a contract, he or she was obliged to make good and whole the other party. In the 21st century, this idea has given way to an American pastime of suing to recoup losses and to be made whole for pain and suffering when a written or implied contract has been breached. However, the body of law surrounding contracts began with the founding of the nation. At that time, manufacturers promised to make goods. Shippers promised to deliver goods. Employers promised to pay wages. At the center of America's vigorous business enterprise was the need for all parties to keep their promises. If these promises weren't kept, the country would fail. The framers of the Constitution recognized this need. So they placed in the Constitution a clause that solved this problem.
Article 1, Section 10, Clause 1. No state shall pass any law impairing the obligation of contracts.
Very quickly, the notion of the sanctity of contracts was put to the test under the Marshall-led Supreme Court. John Marshall was an arch-federalist who believed the country could only prosper if the national government held sovereignty and protected the rights of property owners. So he strove to make the courts a sanctuary for property owners through establishing the inviolability of contracts. Marshall began his defense of contracts in 1810 with the case Fletcher v. Peck. In 1795, speculators bribed members of the Georgia legislature to grant a large tract of western land to the Yazoo Land Company. When the corruption was revealed, a new Georgia legislature blocked the original grant. The Yazoo Company claimants sued for their grant, and the case landed at the Supreme Court in 1810. To Marshall, the case was clear. Georgia's land grant was a binding contract. The circumstances under which it was given did not concern the court. By withdrawing the grant, Georgia had unconstitutionally violated the obligation of the contract. The Marshall Court found in favor of the claimants. 9 years later, Marshall expanded the sanctity of contracts in Dartmouth College v. Woodward. Dartmouth College had been chartered by King George III in 1769. In 1816, New Hampshire turned the private college into a public university. The college trustees sued, claiming the original charter was a contract. Daniel Webster, representing the trustees, argued that New Hampshire had violated the contract clause of the Constitution. His eloquence reportedly brought tears to the eyes of John Marshall. The court ruled that the original English charter was plainly a contract within the letter of the Constitution, the obligation of which cannot be impaired without violating the Constitution of the United States. Dartmouth College v. Woodward expanded the binding principle of contracts to include contracts between states and corporations, and overturned a previous held belief that the states could disregard contracts with private enterprise. As a result, Marshall put United States contract law on a firm constitutional basis, a basis that would make the United States the most enterprising and richest nation on the planet.
The War of 1812 brought a new kind of leader to prominence, the man who rises to power and wealth from humble beginnings. Andrew Jackson was just such a man. For him, the freedoms granted in the United States Constitution were the freedom for the common man to succeed economically and participate democratically in self-rule.
He was the hero of the War of 1812. He was a libertarian who once shot a man off the White House porch for breaking and entering. He was a rugged individualist who championed the common man, believed that the Bill of Rights belonged to everyone, and that the Constitution was not only the world's finest expression of democracy, but it allowed for economic opportunity for every American. He was Andrew Jackson, and his election to the presidency in 1828 brought the national government within the reach of the common man for the first time and changed the nature of American politics forever. Since the founding of the nation in 1776, America had been led by an aristocracy of brilliant and wealthy men, people like George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, Alexander Hamilton, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and John Marshall. This political elite had written the Declaration of Independence, proclaiming the natural rights of men, had created the Constitution with its system of checks and balances, formed the Bill of Rights guaranteeing the civil liberties of citizens, and established the Supreme Court as the highest arbiter of the nation's laws. In the early days of the Union, these founding fathers had given stability to a struggling and impoverished nation. But at the heart of these leaders and their ideals was a distrust of the common man. The result was they created a democratic republic that safeguarded the government and the people's civil rights against the possibility of mob rule. Voting and office holding were limited to men of property. An electoral college elected the president. State legislatures appointed senators. And in the nation's first 36 years, the presidency had practically become a fiefdom of Virginia's wealthy planter class. That changed with the election of General Andrew Jackson and the rise of Jacksonian democracy. The hallmark of Jacksonian democracy was the common man, and General Andrew Jackson was his champion. Like the common man, Jackson rose from humble beginnings, the son of poor Scot-Irish immigrants. Through ambition and energy, he became a lawyer, land speculator, and planter in Tennessee. He was a self-taught military leader whose tactics defeated the Creek Indians at Horseshoe Bend in 1814 and threw back the British invasion of New Orleans in 1815. Once elected president, his administration focused on broadening the base of American democracy and giving the common man a greater voice in politics. Indeed, under Jacksonian democracy, the moral virtue and common sense wisdom of the people were celebrated. Never for a moment believed, said Andrew Jackson, that the great body of the citizens can deliberately intend to do wrong. Armed with the Declaration of Independence and the doctrine of natural rights, Jackson focused on eliminating property qualifications for voting and allowing universal white male suffrage. By 1850, all 31 states had adopted white male suffrage. The common man now had a say in who would represent him in Washington. The theme of extending voting to more citizens would continue. Using the amendment process in 1870, the 15th Amendment gave black men the right to vote. In 1920, women gained the right to vote through the 19th Amendment. And in 1971, the 26th Amendment expanded voting to young men and women who had reached the age of 18.
Following the dictates of Jacksonian democracy, the federal government stepped aside and let the nation grow and prosper. At the same time, the rift was growing between the southern slave-owning states and the non-slavery states in the north. Each new territory raised the question, would it be slave or free? Ultimately, the Constitution had to be changed. Blacks could no longer be counted as property. In the next segment, we will see how the issue of enslavement of black Americans was accommodated through compromise by the federal government until 1861.
Even before the Revolutionary War, American settlers were trickling westward across the Appalachian Mountains into the Ohio River Valley, looking for more land and new places to conquer. They were driven by manifest destiny, the belief that Americans were destined to rule from coast to coast. And by 1848, America's headlong rush for empire paid off. The new nation ruled the continent from the Atlantic to the Pacific. At mid-century, the United States should have rejoiced in its good fortune. Instead, manifest destiny had also brought to the fore the most controversial issue of the age, the expansion of slavery. At the same time, it had laid the groundwork for a showdown on America's greatest constitutional crisis, the question of supremacy. Which was sovereign, the state governments or the national government? Instead of rejoicing, the country was poised to go to war, North against South, abolitionists against slaveholders, nationalists against states' rights supporters. America did not come to the brink of civil war overnight. From the writing of the Constitution in 1787, the forces pitting North against South had been building for 60 years. After the new country was founded, the trickle of westward-bound settlers turned into a torrent. They filled up the land from Daniel Boone's Kentucky to the old Northwest territories of Wisconsin, Michigan, Indiana, Illinois, Ohio, and south into Tennessee, Alabama, and Mississippi. Nor did they stop there. In 1803, President Thomas Jefferson purchased the Louisiana Territory from France, expanding the United States across the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains and beyond. Settlers once more rushed for open space in Minnesota, Iowa, Missouri, and Arkansas. In 1812, hoping to gain Canada, the fledgling United States took a turn at empire building through war against Britain. The war was largely a failure, but undaunted, America continued to expand. In 1819, Spain ceded Spanish Florida to the U.S. Then, with the eastern half of the United States already settled, for the next quarter of a century, people followed trails across the Great Plains to Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, California, Oregon, and Washington. In 1836, Texas gained its independence from Mexico. At the same time, these settlers brought their political positions on slavery and states' rights with them. Northerners believed that any new states formed from the territories should automatically be free from slavery. Southerners believed that slavery should be extended into the new territories, and that any new states had the right to choose for themselves. In 1820, the Missouri Compromise temporarily settled the debate over extending slavery in the territories. The plan maintained the balance of power between free and slave states by admitting Maine as a free state and allowing Missouri to enter as a slave state. At the same time, the compromise banned slavery from the Louisiana Purchase north of the southern boundary of Missouri. Then in 1845, the U.S. annexed Texas. War with Mexico followed. The U.S. easily won, and in 1848, another 500,000 square miles of territory came into American hands. At the same time, the U.S. settled its dispute with Britain over Oregon Territory, setting the boundary between the U.S. and Canada at the 49th parallel. Now the country stretched from coast to coast. Would this new land be free or slave? Once more the problem of slavery rocked the nation, and the stage was set for a bitter conflict between North and South. Southern states needed to expand slavery into new territories in order to maintain a balance of power in Washington, D.C., with free Northern states. In 1850, as the nation moved toward a showdown, Daniel Webster, Henry Clay, and Stephen A. Douglas engineered a solution that would stave off war with a series of acts that became known as the Compromise of 1850. California entered the Union without slavery. Settlers in Arizona and New Mexico territories would decide on slavery themselves, and a stricter fugitive slave law was enacted. At the same time, the U.S. decided against occupying Mexico and annexing it, because that would have meant many new slave states, which the northern politicians would not allow. For several years, the compromise ended the discord. Then the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 made slavery legal in those territories where it had been prohibited by the Missouri Compromise of 1820. 3 years later, the infamous Dred Scott decision by the U.S. Supreme Court invalidated the Missouri Compromise altogether, and at the same time defined slaves as property. The court's 1857 pro-slavery decision all but guaranteed Abraham Lincoln's ascent to the presidency. The questions of slavery and states' rights versus the national government would be settled by war. The Mexican-American War had militarized the nation, and now a generation of officers and men were prepared to fight for the cause they believed in. Indeed, the Mexican-American War proved to be the training ground for military leaders and strategists. Men like Grant, Lee, Meade, and McClellan would command the bloodiest war America ever fought.
The Constitution made it clear that the laws of one state had to be honored by all other states. However, honoring the slave laws of the southern states by the northern states had become an impossibility. The federal government could no longer work without fundamentally changing the Constitution or dissolving the republic and starting anew with two separate and sovereign nations. This was the greatest constitutional crisis the nation would ever face. Before it was resolved, Americans would fight Americans in the bloodiest war the country would ever see.
When the first shells fell upon Fort Sumter in Charleston, South Carolina, on April 12, 1861, they plunged America into the bloodiest, most costly war it would ever fight. There would be over 1 million casualties. The South would take generations to recover economically, and the enmity between Northerners and Southerners would last 100 years. America's Civil War was a moral war and a political war. It was a war to end enslavement, and a war testing the strength of the Union and the sanctity of its Constitution. It was a war that would answer for all time who held supreme power in the United States, the national government or the states. Since the founding of the colonies, the North and South had grown differently. The colder North was more mercantile and industrial. The warmer South was suited to large plantations that worked well with slave labor. By the middle of the 19th century, the country had expanded all the way to the West Coast. The questions of slavery and states' rights also underscored the differences between the sections. Southerners believed that their economy and way of life could only exist through slavery and the sovereignty of the states. Northerners tended to place their trust in a strong national government. Then in 1860, tensions between North and South came to a head when Abraham Lincoln was elected to the presidency. Southern states feared the worst. He would free their slaves. For the South, the only political and economic solution was to assert states' rights and leave the Union in order to keep its slaves. Supporters of states' rights held that the national government was a league of independent states, any of which had the right to secede. On December 20th, 1860, South Carolina issued its Ordinance of Secession, dissolving the union between the state of South Carolina and the other states. On January 5th, Harper's Weekly reported South Carolina's congressman's announcement of secession to the House of Representatives. The people of the state of South Carolina, in their sovereign capacity, have resumed the powers heretofore delegated by them to the federal government of the United States. Georgia, Alabama, Florida, Mississippi, and Louisiana soon followed, and in February 1861, the 6 states of the Deep South created a new confederation of states with a constitution similar to the original United States document, but with a greater emphasis on states' rights. The new president, Abraham Lincoln, asserted the Union was inviolable, that states in joining the Union had given their sovereignty to the national government and had no right to secede. The southern states had not left the Union, but had rebelled against it. He immediately increased the size of the Union Army and ordered that the rebellion be suppressed. By June 1861, the sides were drawn. 23 states in the North faced 11 states in the South. The war did not go well for the North at first, and Lincoln's chances of preserving the Union appeared bleak. From 1861 to 1863, the North suffered many defeats with great casualties. The rout at the First Battle of Bull Run, 30 miles south of Washington, D.C., was followed by more defeats in the Eastern Campaign, which centered around Northern Virginia and Maryland. In June 1862, Southern forces simultaneously defeated Union armies in the Peninsular Campaign south of the Confederacy's capital at Richmond, Virginia, and in Virginia's Shenandoah Valley. They also routed the North at a second Battle of Bull Run in August. The South's most brilliant strategist, General Robert E. Lee, then took his army north in order to show the Union the futility of fighting the Confederacy. But the Union held at Antietam Creek near Sharpsburg, Maryland, and Lee was forced to retreat. This victory gave President Lincoln the opportunity he had been looking for to issue his famous Emancipation Proclamation. He knew that if the Union was to prevail, he had to get the support of the Northern abolitionists. With that in mind, he released his proclamation on January 1st, 1863.
All persons held as slaves within any state or designated part of a state, the people whereof shall then be in rebellion against the United States, shall be then, thenceforward, and forever free.
From this point on, the South's defeat was assured. The North's strategy, slow to develop, began to have an effect. The blockade of southern ports, started at the outset of the war, was slowly strangling the South of the necessary war materials it needed. Meanwhile, the North's superior numbers allowed it to fight Western and Eastern campaigns at the same time. From 1862 to 1864, General Ulysses S. Grant forced his way down the Mississippi River. Victories at Corinth, Tennessee, and Vicksburg, Mississippi, along with the capture of New Orleans by Admiral David Farragut, virtually cut the Confederacy in half. But the South was not done yet. In 1863, General Lee once more took the war to the North. He beat larger armies under the command of General Hooker at Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville. The hope was for quick, decisive victories that would force the North to negotiate for peace. They did not count on Lincoln's resolve or the energy and drive of Northern abolitionists. At Gettysburg, the North turned back Lee's invasion, and the South never seriously threatened the North again. With the fall of Vicksburg on July 4, 1863, the South was forced to wage a defensive war. On April 2, 1865, Richmond fell. 7 days later, Grant trapped Lee at Appomattox and forced his surrender. A war that began so ingloriously for the North ended in a bitter defeat for the South. The country now faced the task of determining the status of the Southern states and planning their reconstruction. Even before the war ended, President Lincoln, believing that Reconstruction was an executive matter, had begun the task of restoration. His plan allowed the former Confederate states to rejoin the Union once they swore allegiance to the Constitution and the Union and abolished slavery. After Lincoln's assassination on April 16, 1865, Vice President Andrew Johnson continued his policies. By the end of 1865, all the Southern states, except for Texas, had formed new governments, repealed their ordinances of secession, abolished slavery, and ratified the 13th Amendment. But radical Republicans in Congress and Northern businessmen wanted the South to pay for her rebellion. They also feared that these new governments would not uphold the rights blacks gained in the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. Led by hardliner Thaddeus Stevens, the Republicans claimed Reconstruction was a congressional function and overrode Johnson's executive orders. On April 28, 1866, the Joint Committee on Reconstruction stated that the ex-Confederate states were in a state of civil disorder and hence had not held valid elections creating new state governments. Congress enacted a series of Reconstruction Acts which divided the South into 5 military districts, each under a Union military commander. Under the terms of the Reconstruction Acts, the Southern states had to submit new constitutions. By 1870, all Southern states were readmitted after ratifying the 14th and 15th Amendments. As a result, the 2 most important constitutional questions ever to arise were finally laid to rest. Slavery was abolished, and the supremacy of the national government over the states was firmly established.
With the Civil War over, the nation once again prospered well into the first part of the 20th century. It would also be a time of the greatest constitutional change and expansion as 6 new profound amendments were added to the United States Constitution. Join me in the 6th episode of A History of the United States Constitution. I'm Jeff Fahey, and thank you for watching.
It is one of the world's most sacred documents. It is a product of the eternal search for liberty and freedom. It reflects the times during which it was conceived, and at the same time, it has been a guide to an unknown and rapidly changing future. It is the United States of America's Constitution. In this series, we shall see how this document has served to shelter the American people from the abuses of power and tyranny. How for over 2 centuries the U.S. Constitution has empowered Americans to excel and aspire to greatness. Great art, great literature, excellence and leadership in science and technology, and how the Constitution has allowed the United States to become the most prosperous and most powerful nation the planet has ever seen.
Hi, I'm Jeff Fahey, and welcome to the 6th episode of A History of the United States Constitution. From the end of the Civil War to the start of the Roaring Twenties is a fascinating time of constitutional change. The enslavement of black Americans, sanctioned in the Constitution, is finally corrected. 6 new amendments are added to the United States governing document, including the first attempt to use the Constitution for social engineering. In addition, through an obscure clause in the U.S. Constitution, Washington finds a way to get involved in almost every aspect of the national economy. With the Civil War over, so was America's greatest constitutional crisis. The Union of States had held together. It had been 61 years since the Constitution was last amended. Now, with the South weakened, 3 new amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th, ended slavery, made blacks citizens of the United States, and gave black men the right to vote.
In the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson spoke of the natural rights of all men, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. 11 years later, the United States Constitution was written to secure those blessings of liberty. Yet the Constitution and the Bill of Rights which followed denied the vote to all non-whites and all women. In fact, blacks were considered 3/5 of a person. Finally, a war would be fought, the Civil War, which would later be described as a war to end slavery. However, to make this promise a reality, abolitionists such as Frederick Douglass worked tirelessly with radical Republican leaders Charles Sumner and Thaddeus Stevens to correct the errors of the nation's founding fathers by adding 3 momentous amendments to the Constitution.
13th Amendment. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction.
14th Amendment. All persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of a citizen of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of the law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws.
15th Amendment. The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude.
48 years before women were granted the right to vote by the 19th Amendment, a woman reformer started the ball rolling with an act of defiance.
At her so-called trial for attempting to vote in Rochester, New York in 1872, the judge found her guilty and fined her $100. He then asked her if she had anything to say. Susan B. Anthony replied heatedly,
"Yes, Your Honor, I have many things to say, for in your ordered verdict of guilty, you have trampled underfoot every vital principle of our government. My natural rights, my civil rights, my political rights, my judicial rights are all alike ignored. Robbed of the fundamental privilege of citizenship, I am degraded from the status of a citizen to that of a subject, and not only myself individually, but all of my sex, are, by your honor's verdict, doomed to political subjection under this so-called form of government.
Susan B. Anthony and a friend, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, became leaders in the campaign to give the right to vote to women. In 1870, black males gained the right to vote through the 15th Amendment. However, the journey for a woman's right to vote would be a long one. In 1878, the woman suffrage bill was introduced in Congress, but not passed. Ironically, a Montana woman, Jeanette Rankin, would be elected to that same Congress before women would be allowed to vote in national elections. Finally, August 26, 1920, the 19th Amendment, allowing women the right to vote, was passed into law. It had virtually the same language as the bill introduced 42 years before. The women's suffrage movement was a part of a wave of reform activities that sprung up prior to the Civil War.
It may be said, without much exaggeration, that everything is done now by societies. You can scarcely name an object for which some institution has not been formed. William Ellery Channing.
These societies would become institutions that have carried through to the 21st century, performing a balancing act to the many injustices perpetrated by big business and government.
The framers of the Constitution were often purposely vague, such as giving Congress the power to act, as in setting up the federal court system, while at the same time not spelling out how Congress should accomplish that task. In the next segment, we will see how Congress, using one of those vague directives, created a congressional act that would eventually impact American life as much as any subsequent constitutional amendment or ruling.
By the late 19th century, American farmers were the most productive in the world, and yet farmers were becoming poorer, squeezed between lower prices for their products and higher shipping rates charged by America's railroad trusts. Desperate, the farmers demanded help, and in 1887 they got it in a curious piece of congressional legislation. The act was never supposed to amount to much, and yet it would change the course of American government for the next 120 years. It was the Interstate Commerce Act. Since the founding of the colonies, Americans have prized unregulated trade. Colonial merchants were often smugglers as well as traders. One of the causes of the Revolutionary War was the American right of free trade free from British interference. The result was that a freewheeling business philosophy, later known as laissez-faire, governed American economic policy for the first 150 years of the nation's existence. Under laissez-faire, the federal government refused to intervene in the economy. Instead, it supported the concept of an invisible hand in the marketplace to regulate and control the economy. An unregulated marketplace had always suited the American ideals of rugged individualism, freedom, and self-determination. After the Civil War, America's unregulated marketplace enjoyed unparalleled business growth. Corporations and trusts ruled industries such as steel, oil, and railroads. Railroad trusts in particular drove many farmers out of business by charging steep shipping rates. Then in 1887, the U.S. Congress, using the Constitution's Commerce Clause, created change.
Article 1, Section 8, Clause 3 of the Constitution. The Congress shall have the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations, and among the several states, and with the Indian tribes.
Using this clause, Congress enacted the Interstate Commerce Act, specifically to set guidelines on how the railroads could do business. The act required that shipping rates had to be published and had to be reasonable and just. It also outlawed secret rebates and price discrimination. But its most important feature was a 5-member enforcement board known as the Interstate Commerce Commission. The ICC was the first regulatory commission in U.S. history. Until President Theodore Roosevelt, the ICC was not very effective because it had no power of enforcement. But the Hepburn Act of 1906 gave the ICC the power to change a railroad rate to one it considered just and reasonable. Other acts followed, and the ICC's jurisdiction was gradually extended beyond railroads to all common carriers except airplanes, including trucking companies, bus lines, freight forwarders, water carriers, and oil pipelines. Supreme Court decisions also broadened the powers of the ICC. In the 1960s, the ICC enforced U.S. Supreme Court rulings desegregating passenger terminals. In 1966, the newly created Department of Transportation took over the ICC's safety enforcement. Over the next 30 years, the ICC steadily lost its powers to regulate railroads and trucking companies' routes and rates, until the agency was terminated in 1995, and its remaining function turned over to the National Surface Transportation Board. But the legacy of the Interstate Commerce Act continues in the 21st century. It had become one of the country's most important documents, providing Congress the right to regulate private corporations engaged in interstate commerce. In addition, the Interstate Commerce Commission would become the model for federal government regulatory agencies. By the 21st century, that curious little act of 1887 has led to nearly 1,000 federal government regulatory agencies, commissions, and committees. Over 800 are in the executive branch alone. Some of the most important are the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, the FDIC, the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, and the Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC.
When the Southern states recovered from the Civil War, they found a way around equality for all Americans, in particular, equal opportunity for their black citizens. That way was to create two Americas, one white and the other black. Hence the notorious Jim Crow laws, the separate but equal facilities for blacks and whites, which produced a segregated country.
In 1896, the Supreme Court of the United States rubber-stamped the principle of equal but separate for blacks and whites in southern states. The upholding of Plessy versus Ferguson would guarantee segregation, and racial hatred would persist for another 3/4 of a century. When federal troops pulled out of the South in 1877, whites quickly found legal ways to deprive blacks of their equal rights, and went on to pass a series of Jim Crow laws, making it illegal for blacks and whites to commingle. They could not share the same restaurants, schools, trains, and public and private institutions. In 1890, Louisiana passed a Jim Crow law requiring railroads to provide separate cars for blacks and whites. Homer Plessy challenged the law by sitting in a whites-only car and was arrested. Plessy claimed the law violated the 14th Amendment clause of equal protection under the law. The state of Louisiana argued that blacks received equal treatment, just separate. The case went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. Justice John Marshall Harlan wrote the minority dissent.
Our Constitution is colorblind, and neither knows nor tolerates classes among citizens. In respect of civil rights, all citizens are equal before the law.
But the court's majority sided with the state. The majority opinion said,
"We consider the underlying fallacy of the plaintiff's argument to consist in the assumption of that the enforced separation of the two races stamps the colored race with a badge of inferiority. If this be so, it is not by reason of anything found in the Act, but solely because the colored race chooses to put that construction upon it. The argument also assumes that social prejudices may be overcome by legislation. We cannot accept this proposition. Legislation is powerless to eradicate racial instincts or to abolish distinctions based upon physical differences. If one race be inferior to the other socially, the Constitution of the United States cannot put them upon the same plane.
Thus, the federal government abandoned the blacks' cause of integration into American political life, leaving this divisive issue for succeeding generations to solve.
Unjust taxation of the colonies by the monarchy was one of the primary reasons for America's fight for freedom from the British rule. Indeed, the revolutionary rallying cry, "Taxation without representation is tyranny," rang out loud and clear in the air of Philadelphia as the framers wrote the U.S. Constitution. For 124 years, it was constitutionally unclear whether the federal government could have a national income tax. In what turned out to be one of the most bizarre constitutional stories, the 16th Amendment gave the national government just such a power, based on the slogan, "Soak the rich."
After the original 10 amendments to the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, 2 new amendments were added at the end of the 18th century. The most significant, the 12th, mandated that the vice president be from the same party as the president. In the 19th century, 3 more amendments were added, largely coming out of the Civil War and dealing with rights for the newly freed slaves. Then for 40 years, national politics was quiescent. However, when Teddy Roosevelt resurrected the presidency and pushed for reforms, the federal government needed to assure it could pay for its expanded role. This meant more taxes. But there was a problem. The Constitution stated, "No capitation or other direct tax shall be laid unless in proportion to the census or enumeration herein, before directed to be taken." The result was that the power to implement a direct tax such as an income tax was significantly ambiguous, needing an amendment to make it possible. Then in 1909, a funny thing happened. The amendment that was not supposed to be. Joseph Bailey, Democrat, from Texas, introduced the bill giving Congress new taxing powers to embarrass Republicans. To his amazement, several leading progressive Republicans, including Teddy Roosevelt, supported the bill. Conservative Republicans knew that they could not oppose the bill without appearing to be in the pockets of the wealthy. Trying a political ploy, Republicans introduced a countermeasure, which called for an income tax to be an amendment to the Constitution. They figured it would not muster the 3/4 of the states necessary to pass. To the delight of progressive Republicans and Democrats, state after state ratified the amendment following the slogan, "Soak the rich."
16th Amendment. The Congress shall have the power to lay and collect taxes on incomes from whatever source derived, without apportionment among the several states, and without regard to any census or enumeration.
As the 20th century progressed, America's tax situation became the most bizarre of any country in the world, and the rich never got soaked.
In the same year that the Income Tax Amendment was ratified, participatory democracy was extended. The 17th Amendment permitted for the first time the direct election of senators by American citizens.
Presidential primaries and election night coverage of senatorial races are common in the 21st century. However, when Al Gore won the popular vote in 2000 and did not win the election, Americans had a reminder of how the Constitution's framers thought about citizen voting. They believed that the people could not be trusted to choose their representatives wisely, so they prevented the common people from participating in the direct election of the president by creating the Electoral College, and they sought the indirect election of senators through appointment by the state's legislatures. Only representatives from the House were elected by popular vote. In the latter part of the 19th century, the process of selecting senatorial and presidential candidates was often relegated to the proverbial smoke-filled back rooms. Party machinery, more often than not under the control of business interests, picked the candidates for national office. By the end of the 19th century, many Americans felt the time for change had arrived. The presidency felt the movement for reform first. In 1888, Massachusetts adopted a true secret ballot as a solution to vested interests, hand-picking their candidates. From this step, the concept of a presidential primary election emerged. In 1901, Minnesota mandated the first statewide direct primary. Then, under the leadership of progressive Governor Robert La Follette, Wisconsin passed a comprehensive presidential primary law in 1905. By 1912, 13 states had some form of primary elections. The direct election of senators was next. The battle cry was, more democracy was always better. With the passage of the 17th Amendment in 1912 and the ratification a year later, senators were thereafter elected directly by the people.
17th Amendment. The Senate of the United States shall be composed of 2 senators from each state, elected by the people thereof for 6 years, and each senator shall have 1 vote.
As a result, it is hard to imagine the election of many of the 20th century's colorful and maverick senators if not for the 17th Amendment. Individuals like William Proxmire of Wisconsin, Paul Wellstone from Minnesota, Everett Dirksen of Illinois, and Dianne Feinstein of California would have been overlooked by the party machinery of the 19th century.
As a result of the passage of the Interstate Commerce Act in 1887, the federal government became increasingly more powerful. Teddy Roosevelt realized the presidency had languished since the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. Roosevelt made one bold move after another. He used his presidential powers to force construction of the Panama Canal, to bust the monopolies to empower labor, and set aside millions of acres of land for conservation and national parks. From his presidency on, the federal government took a hands-on approach to American business. In the fervor of the idea the government knows best, the constitutional process was for the first time used to take away a right from the American citizen, the right to drink alcohol. Though perhaps morally sound to some, the 18th Amendment's attempt at social engineering was a disaster.
America of the 19th century saw 3 great movements: abolition of slavery, women's suffrage, and temperance. The first 2 extended liberty and democracy. The last would become one of the nation's monumental failures. It was an attempt at social engineering, an attempt to control behavior. From the founding of the colonies, sanitary drinking water was not easy to come by. Alcohol and tea took its place. They were pure enough not to give the drinker typhoid or cholera. The 4th President, James Madison, was known for drinking a quart of whiskey a day. At the center of America's drinking was the saloon. There was 1 saloon for every 150 Americans, and they were a hotbed for other vices from gambling to prostitution. Consequently, the incidence of alcoholism, public intoxication, and lewdness was rampant, if not expected. The drunken husband was the curse of the married woman. In response to the evils of alcoholism grew the idea of prohibition, outlawing the making, sale, and consumption of alcohol. The demand for prohibition came out of the Midwest progressive movement and had its foundations in a religious-led war against alcohol as an offense against God, a social evil, and as a major stumbling block against the creation of a heaven on earth. The anti-alcohol mood that swept the country in the 1900s was not unlike the religious revivals led by George Whitefield in the 18th century. America was ready to embark upon its first experiment in social engineering.
18th Amendment. After 1 year from the ratification of this article, the manufacture, sale, or transportation of intoxicating liquors within, the importation thereof into, or the exportation thereof from the United States, and all territories subject to the jurisdiction thereof for beverage purposes, is hereby prohibited.
With passage of the 18th Amendment, prohibition began in 1919. It was an experiment doomed almost immediately to failure. As the fervency of righteousness wore off in the roaring 20s that followed.
Somebody spilled the beans, and now prohibition agents are spilling the beer.
A small force of federal agents, state and local police were called upon to enforce a law that affected millions of Americans who wanted to drink. The result was like using a pea shooter to stop an armored car. Nothing could halt Americans' desire to drink.
Talk about showers. How'd you like to stand under this one?
The same independence and desire for freedom that brought immigrants to its shores fueled Americans to flaunt the laws against alcohol. Instead of heaven on earth, prohibition gave rise to the speakeasy, illegal bars that were the cradle of organized crime. A problem that has haunted the U.S. ever since. The anti-alcohol experiment of the early 20th century would repeat itself in the last half of the same century with America's war on drugs, unfortunately with the same underworld consequences. As for prohibition, the 21st Amendment repealed it in 1933. By this time, the law was virtually unenforceable, and a nation beleaguered by the Depression needed something to raise its spirits.
In the 7th episode of A History of the United States Constitution, the Constitution faces a new kind of challenge. Can a document written 150 years ago still be a guide to an America that is now a major player on the world stage? An America that is going through constant and rapid technological and social change. And in these new and swiftly changing times, are severely limited federal powers still valid? And can our freedoms and civil rights still be absolute? I'm Jeff Fahey, and thanks for watching.
It is one of the world's most sacred documents. It is a product of the eternal search for liberty and freedom. It reflects the times during which it was conceived, and at the same time, it has been a guide to an unknown and rapidly changing future. It is the United States of America's Constitution. In this series, we shall see how this document has served to shelter the American people from the abuses of power and tyranny. How for over 2 centuries the U.S. Constitution has empowered Americans to excel and aspire to greatness. Great art, great literature, excellence and leadership in science and technology. And how the Constitution has allowed the United States to become the most prosperous and most powerful nation the planet has ever seen.
Hi, I'm Jeff Fahey, and welcome to the 8th and final episode of A History of the United States Constitution. In the final third of the 20th century and into the 21st, knowledge and debate over the meaning of the Constitution reached a level only achieved once before during its drafting. During this time, through the new medium of television, the press truly became the fourth branch of government, engaging the public about the constitutionality of every political action by the federal government. This was also a time when the Supreme Court rose to equality with the other branches of government, a time when the civil rights expressed in U.S. Constitution were liberally interpreted in favor of the common American citizen, a time when legal equality was finally achieved by Black Americans, and a time when the Constitution itself once again demonstrated the foresight of the Founding Fathers in writing a document that has passed on the freedoms fought and gained in the American Revolutionary War. In 1953, President Eisenhower appointed Earl Warren to the U.S. Supreme Court. Not since John Marshall, 150 years earlier, had one man empowered the court to such phenomenal heights within the system of checks and balances laid out by the Constitution. At the same time, the Warren Court actively strengthened civil rights protection for all Americans. Mapp v. Ohio and Miranda v. Arizona are just two of the better-known decisions that typified the Warren Court.
In the 21st century, nearly every American knows his or her Fourth Amendment rights, not because they read the Constitution, but because of a plethora of law and order TV shows watched weekly for the past 25 years.
Police, search warrant!
Routinely, legal and police dramas show judges issuing warrants to search someone's house or apartment. This civil right, the right of citizens to be free from unwarranted government intrusion, was one of the Founding Fathers' most cherished freedoms. It was so important that the states insisted on spelling out that right in the Bill of Rights' Fourth Amendment.
Fourth Amendment. The right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated, and no warrants shall issue, but upon probable cause, supported by oath or affirmation, and particularly describing the place to be searched and the persons or things to be seized.
But defense from government trespass wasn't always so clear. In fact, the Fourth Amendment protection against unlawful search and seizure was not applied to state courts and police until 1961. Indeed, for most of the nation's history, state and local governments were not controlled by the Fourth Amendment, unless a state's constitution granted that right for its citizens. Then on May 23, 1957, 3 Cleveland police officers without a search warrant broke into Dorlee Mapp's home, looking for a fugitive wanted in a bombing. Searching her home, they found obscene materials and arrested Ms. Mapp. At Mapp's trial, no search warrant was produced by the prosecution. Instead, the state argued that even an unreasonable or illegal search did not prevent the prosecution from using at trial what was claimed by Mapp's lawyers to be unconstitutionally seized evidence. But in 1961, the Warren Court reversed previous rulings. Justice Tom Clark read the opinion of the court, which stated that by the power of the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment, states were required to follow the same rules of evidence gathering that the federal government must follow. Evidence obtained illegally through an unlawful search must be excluded. This became known as the exclusionary rule, a rule which forbids the government from using illegally obtained evidence against a defendant at trial. As a result of watching police television dramas, most Americans in the 21st century take their legal rights for granted.
Have the right to remain silent.
If arrested, they know they have the right to an attorney, the right to remain silent, and they know that anything that they say can be used against them in a court of law. Throughout the 200-plus years of the nation, these rights have evolved, giving more protections to the innocent. However, no court gave more power to these rights than the Warren Court. President Eisenhower appointed Earl Warren to be Chief Justice of the Supreme Court in 1953. It was a decision the conservative Eisenhower would soon regret. Earl Warren was born in Los Angeles and grew up in Bakersfield, California. The son of a railroad car mechanic, he rose through the ranks of California politics to become the Republican governor of California. He was so popular that he ran unopposed for a second term after winning both the Republican and Democratic primaries. In spite of his strong Republican Party credentials, Chief Justice Warren's court surprisingly came to define what would be known for the next 50 years as the liberal social agenda of strengthening and extending opportunities and civil rights for Americans. It started with his first big case, Brown v. Board of Education. In that 1954 decision, Warren persuaded his fellow justices to support racial equality and strike down segregation in America's public schools. However, it was in protecting the rights of the accused that Warren forged his greatest and most consequential decisions. They led to the famous words that police officers state to all who are arrested, the Miranda warning.
You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford one, one will be appointed to you.
These rights stemmed from specific cases, landmark rulings to protect the rights of the innocent. The first case was Gideon v. Wainwright in 1963. In this case, the Warren Court unanimously found that if a defendant could not afford an attorney, one had to be provided for him. In the 1964 case, Escobedo v. Illinois, the Warren Court handed down the next part of the Miranda warning, that a suspect not only had the right to an attorney, but the right to remain silent. Finally, in Miranda v. Arizona, the Warren Court ruled that a suspect had to be read his rights. In this decision, the court overturned a confession by Ernesto Miranda, stating that a criminal suspect must be informed of not only his Sixth Amendment right to counsel, but his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination. In 3 years and 3 cases, the Warren Court changed the face of the American legal system for the rest of the century. Earl Warren retired from the court in 1969. But his legacy lived on in these words he spoke, describing his vision of the Constitution. It is the spirit and not the form of law that keeps justice alive.
While the 15th Amendment made it legal for blacks to vote, the 24th Amendment actually made it possible for them to vote freely. It was one more step towards equal opportunity for all and equal protection for all, spelled out nearly 200 years earlier in the Declaration of Independence.
In 1964, 2 monumental achievements by the federal government provided the last 2 pieces of the puzzle to give blacks their full rights as citizens: the Civil Rights Act and the 24th Amendment. Go to any U.S. city in the 21st century, and black Americans participate fully in the American dream. They buy homes, send their children to good schools, and work hard at good jobs. But 100 years ago, it wasn't like this. Throughout the first half of the 20th century, blacks lived under the oppression of Jim Crow laws, laws designed specifically to discriminate against blacks in housing, employment, education. These laws also kept blacks from exercising their fundamental civil rights as citizens. the right to a fair trial by a jury of their peers, and especially the right to vote. Then in the 1950s, blacks began to win those rights through a series of spectacular court cases and civil actions. In 1954, the Supreme Court ruled in Brown v. Board of Education that segregated schools were unconstitutional. In 1955, Rosa Parks started a civil action that desegregated Montgomery, Alabama's city buses. Sit-ins throughout the South in 1960 ended discrimination in restaurants and lunch counters. A year later, the Freedom Riders rode buses through the South and ended segregation at interstate bus terminals. But 1964 saw the greatest single gains by blacks since emancipation and the end of Reconstruction in the 19th century, with passage of two significant triumphs, the Civil Rights Act and the 24th Amendment. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 outlawed discrimination in public places. It also set up the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission to prevent discrimination in employment. Lesser known was the 24th Amendment, which tore down the last barrier preventing blacks from exercising their right to vote. The 24th Amendment prohibited poll taxes. A poll tax was a tax levied on persons as a requirement for voting. White poll supervisors would charge excessive amounts on poor black voters, making it impossible for them to vote. In 1962, President John F. Kennedy and Congress decided that the only way to remove the poll tax was to enact the 24th Amendment. With its ratification on January 23, 1964, the final barrier to black participation in government was removed.
24th Amendment. The right of citizens of the United States to vote in any primary or other election for president or vice president, for electors for president or vice president, or for senator or representative in Congress shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or any state by reason of failure to pay any poll tax or other tax.
The last three amendments to the Constitution are in effect minor corrections. The 27th merely stated that Congress could not give itself a pay raise. The 26th gave 18-year-olds the right to vote, but the 25th, ratified in 1967, seemed to foretell the constitutional crisis the nation would have to face in the presidential scandal known as Watergate. The end result of the Watergate abuse of power was the resignation of President Nixon. However, its constitutional significance was that once more the balance of power laid out by the Founding Fathers worked brilliantly, as Congress and the Supreme Court checked the overreaching power the presidency had been accumulating for 75 years.
In 1950, a brand new medium swept the nation: television. Almost overnight, the nation became smaller as Americans learned more and more about their country and the people who lived here. But one of television's greatest impacts was on the political landscape. For the first time, a majority of Americans got to see their leaders live instead of learning about them through newspaper articles or movie newsreels. In 1960, television proved to be a deciding factor in the presidential election between John Kennedy and Richard Nixon. The result of television's influence was a series of constitutional reform amendments. In 1963, the assassination of President John F. Kennedy shocked the nation. But medical technology might have saved his life, perhaps only to have him live in a coma or be unable to fulfill his duties as president. A constitutional crisis would have resulted. Who now had the power of the presidency? As a result, less than 2 years later, Congress passed the 25th Amendment, clarifying the line of succession if the president was unable to fulfill his duties.
25th Amendment. Section 1. In case of the removal of the president from office or of his death or resignation, the vice president shall become president. Section 2. whenever there is a vacancy in the office of Vice President, the President shall nominate a Vice President who shall take office upon confirmation by a majority vote of both houses of Congress.
7 years later, the provisions of the amendment were carried out for the first time during the presidency of Richard M. Nixon. In 1973, Vice President Spiro Agnew was forced to resign when charged with accepting bribes and falsifying federal tax returns. President Nixon then appointed Gerald Ford as his vice president.
Therefore, I shall resign the presidency.
A year later, President Nixon resigned because of his involvement in the cover-up of the Watergate burglary. Ford became president according to the provisions of the amendment. By 1971, Americans had watched for 6 years on TV a bloody war fought halfway around the world in the jungles of Vietnam, mainly by young men between the ages of 18 and 21. Ironically, 18-year-olds were asked to fight and die for their country, but were not allowed to vote. On March 23, 1971, Congress resolved this contradiction by passing the 26th Amendment, specifically lowering the national voting age in all elections from 21 to 18. In just 100 days, on July 1, 1971, the 26th Amendment was ratified by the states.
26th Amendment. The right of citizens of the United States who are 18 years of age or older to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of age.
1972 was the first presidential election in which 18-year-olds could vote. 55% of 18 to 24-year-olds voted. In the last quarter of the 20th century, television increased its influence on the American public with 24-hour cable news programs like CNN. Americans began to see their public officials more like next-door neighbors instead of bigger-than-life politicians. At the same time, they began to question politicians' effectiveness and whether they were worth the money the American people paid them. As a result, an amendment that had languished for 200 years since the founding of the nation was revived and passed. The Constitution's 27th Amendment limited the pay of Congress.
27th Amendment. No law varying the compensation for the services of the senators and representatives shall take effect until an election of representatives shall have intervened.
The Burger Court would once more affirm the sanctity of property ownership and the right of privacy in a startling way, this time in terms of a person's body.
It was the most political and perhaps the most shocking decision ever handed down by the U.S. Supreme Court. As a result, after 1973, every politician, every high judicial appointment, every attorney general would have to lay out how he or she felt about the law created by 9 black-robed gentlemen on that January day. The decision was Roe v. Wade, guaranteeing a woman's right to an abortion. In 1970, abortions in Texas were illegal, as they were in most other states. Norma McCorvey, 21 and single, found herself with an unwanted pregnancy. In no condition to raise another child, Norma wanted an abortion. She met with a lawyer, Linda Coffey, a women's rights activist, and agreed to test the Texas abortion statutes as unconstitutional. To protect Norma, they changed her name to Jane Roe. The lawsuit became Roe v. Wade. Henry Wade was the Dallas, Texas district attorney arguing in favor of abortion laws. The case went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. The Ninth Amendment stated that the rights not spelled out in the Constitution belong to the people. The author of the Bill of Rights, James Madison, had put this in to protect American citizens from the tyranny of the state. Earlier courts had used this argument in Griswold v. Connecticut to proclaim the right to privacy in the bedroom. In Roe v. Wade, the Supreme Court extended this idea to a woman's right to do with her body what she chose, within limits. From that moment on, Roe v. Wade became one of the most polarizing issues in America. A pitched battle developed between the pro-choice advocates on the left and the right-to-life advocates on the right. Battles that at times turned violent as tens of thousands of abortion protesters were arrested, abortion clinics bombed, and doctors killed. Nevertheless, in the last year of the century, American doctors performed 861,000 legal abortions.
Thanks to Chief Justices like Warren, Burger, and Rehnquist, by the end of the 20th century, the Supreme Court had made itself into an equal player with the other two branches of the federal government. Then, in the presidential election of 2000, all the issues that had arisen at the 1787 Constitutional Convention came into focus once again. States' rights versus federal power, and the sanctity of the Constitution as interpreted by the Supreme Court as the ultimate law of the land.
When the Founding Fathers met in Philadelphia to create a new government for the United States of America, they settled on a unique form of constitutional government, one of checks and balances, one that would have to accommodate conflicting interests from region to region and from state to state. As Gouverneur Morris, one of the Founding Fathers, wrote in a letter sent to the state legislatures with a draft of the Constitution, all individuals entering into society must give up a share of liberty to preserve the rest. However, none of the ideals laid out in the Constitution and the Bill of Rights would matter if the people did not support the need for the restriction of governmental power, and in particular, the need to accommodate conflicting interests. America's constitutional government would face many tests. It was tested when the first president, George Washington, did not run for a third term, and was replaced by the newly elected John Adams. It was tested again when Thomas Jefferson from the Republican Party won the presidential election over the Federalist candidate, John Adams. 3 years later, Jefferson, on his own authority, purchased the Louisiana Territory from France. Jefferson justified his action by citing implied powers inherent in the presidency, allowing him to take discretionary action for the common good of the country. His action was accepted by the people, and the good of the nation was served. In 1803, the U.S. Supreme Court, led by Chief Justice John Marshall, ruled that the court had the final say on all matters constitutional and legal. The nation accepted the court's decision. In 1861, the nation faced its greatest test under President Abraham Lincoln, when the Civil War proved once and for all the United States was one nation, indivisible. 3 years later, Andrew Johnson survived impeachment by an overreaching Congress, determined to exert its authority in domestic matters. For the rest of the century, the American presidency would be in decline. Then, during the first two-thirds of the 20th century, the power of the presidency grew through such strong leaders as Teddy Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and Lyndon Baines Johnson. Then in 1974, the Watergate scandal forced President Richard Nixon to resign, and the balance of power among the branches of government was once more restored. As the 20th century came to an end, 27 amendments had been added to the Constitution. Enslavement of black Americans was ended. All citizens over the age of 18 could vote. Equal opportunity for all, particularly educational and economic opportunity for all, was greater than ever before. The common man faced greater legal protections and justice than ever before in the nation's history. But as Americans were set to embark into a new millennium, fate would provide one more constitutional crisis. In the presidential election of 2000, Albert Gore, President Clinton's vice president, ran against George W. Bush, the 41st president's son. However, there was no clear victory when the votes were tabulated. Voting irregularities in Florida made it impossible to decide which candidate had won that state's decisive 25 electoral votes. A month passed, with numerous court challenges and recounts before the election was finally certified after the U.S. Supreme Court stepped in and ruled against the Florida State Supreme Court's decision to continue recounts. In Bush v. Gore, the Supreme Court's 5-4 decision stopped all further recounts and declared Bush the winner even though Gore had won the nation's popular vote. Like Jefferson's decision to purchase Louisiana from France 200 years earlier, the Supreme Court used discretionary action, citing the common good of the nation as a justification for their decision. In the year that followed, the American people accepted the decision, especially in the wake of the terrorist attacks of 9/11-2001. Which drew the public's attention away from the court's precedent-setting action. However, with this decision, the Supreme Court gave notice that it was assuming even more powers than before. In the 21st century, it will be up to all Americans to ensure their unique form of constitutional government continues its delicate balance between governmental power and accommodating the many different and at times conflicting interests of its citizens. Interests that have been with our nation from the beginning, including separation of church and state, the regulation of business, and the state's rights versus federal power, such as in the summer of 2005 when the Supreme Court expanded the state's power of eminent domain. But also there were new conflicting constitutional interests: gay marriage, pro-choice versus the right to life, affirmative action, and, as Bush v. Gore pointed out, judicial activism.
After more than 200 years as the ultimate law of the Republic, the United States Constitution has served the nation well. Civil rights are greater now than they were when the original 13 states ratified the Bill of Rights in 1791. However, federal powers are also greater than at any time before. Perhaps this is the way the framers of the Constitution intended for it to work. For in the 21st century, Americans are still the freest people in the world. I'm Jeff Fahey, and thank you for watching A History of the United States Constitution.